Good morning, everyone. This is M.R. Rangaswamy, the founder of Indiaspora. Welcome to the fourth annual virtual Indiaspora Climate Summit. We, as usual, have broken this into two segments. This is the Western Hemisphere, so I want to wish everyone a good morning, a good afternoon, and some of you a good evening as well. And this is, like I said, the fourth annual summit that we've had virtually. Again, this is a very important issue for us, both personally, having started a forum called the Corporate Eco Forum 16 years ago to really bring climate action to the forefront of large Fortune 500 companies. And also the Indiaspora community has resonated deeply with the same issue. We've had several climate discussions at Indiaspora as well, including a session at COP28 this past year in Dubai, where we had 200 diaspora come together in Dubai to discuss climate action as well. Now, this has taken even more urgency. As you know, both here in the US and in India, we've seen extreme climate, both drought and floods, heat and cold. And this is upon us, ladies and gentlemen. And this is an issue that's important to both my generation, but also more importantly to the next generation, our kids, our grandkids, and others who follow us. So if you want to keep in touch with Indiaspora, please go to indiaspora.org and you can subscribe to our newsletter and get our blogs and many other details on our network. Again, we are a nonprofit network of diaspora leaders across the world, including the US, Canada, UK, Singapore, UAE, and Australia, where we have chapters. And we also have an office in India as well. So welcome. We'll get started with our opening keynote. And to do this is my dear friend, Andrew Mayock. Andrew is the Chief Sustainability Officer of the US government. He works for President Biden in the White House and has done a remarkable job with getting climate action within the government itself, including, as he will tell you, a lot of projects on electrification, green buildings, and much, much more, really setting the stage for all of us to follow what he and the government are doing their part in the whole climate space. Andrew, before he was in the Biden administration, has been in the Obama administration. He's been in the Clinton administration. He's a lot of public service experience as well as private service, having started his career a while ago at McKinsey and Company as well. So Andrew, please welcome and please have your opening remarks, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A with you. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, MR. Thank you for your leadership, and thanks for the whole team at Indiaspora for bringing us together today. I want to thank you, MR, for not only your leadership from the Indian community, but as you pointed out, sustainability too. I've had the opportunity to participate and gain the benefits of bringing the corporate community together with the public sector, in my case, to do this urgent work that we're doing today, and to have the opportunity to join the Indian community today as an extraordinary bonus. So I'm very excited to be here. We have no better friend in the White House than you, MR, and we really appreciate your partnership through and through. Want to thank all the audience members that are joining us today from across the different time zones, as was just mentioned. I think that goes to this participation across these many regions, goes to the essence of what we're doing today. They're an urgent climate conversation for this urgent time. So I'm humbled to join you today and have a conversation with you today about the collective work that we're involved in. I'm also humbled by the opportunity to work with so many from the Indian community in the White House. First and foremost, of course, the Vice President of the United States, in addition to so many other colleagues like Domestic Policy Counsel's Neera Tandon, Gautam Raghavan, who is lead for the President on personnel, speechwriter Vinay Reddy, NSC's Tarun Chabra, and so many other colleagues. And in addition to those names who I think a lot of people here might know, I just like to cite a few people who I'd call unsung heroes on my immediate team from the Indian community, who are the folks who are actually delivering on the work that I get to share with you today. And that includes people like Tanuj Diora and Rishi Garg and Rami Attella and Hetal Jain, That's just a few of the folks in our media team who represent this community and are doing this really critical work. I want to give them a shout out as well. For our conversation today, and as you think about and talk about the work that we're involved in over the course of the day, I wanted to, set the context, building on what MR just mentioned about number one, this moment of urgency, and this also moment of opportunity. And number two is this, in President Biden's words and common phrasing, be the decade of action. I want to spend a few minutes on that and how we're delivering, picking up on what MR shared about that too. And then third, to talk about our collective work, how we can work together, how we can make this the moment of action and real and outsized outcomes that we need for this day. So first, a couple words about this urgent moment. Probably does not need to be said to this community, but just lifting up and recognizing what's happening, as MR also noted, this urgent time that we're in, this record-setting time, and that we live in a time where day after day we see record-breaking heat, record-breaking drought, record-breaking precipitation, record-breaking floods, and record-breaking damage. And one can look no further than a region next to you or a country next to you to see the really profound effects of climate. And as President Biden says, the clear and urgent danger that climate impacts provide now. So, where it was more, I think, for some of us, an academic question as to whether is climate change real? Is it affecting us? It is, clearly here today, and the effects of it are built in. So the moment of action couldn't be more urgent. And it's also, as President Biden says, a time of enormous economic opportunity. There's clear to the threat that I just mentioned, but the incredible once in a generation economic opportunity that this is, and that was, a policy idea and a policy proposal in the first year of the Biden administration, and a reality that we're seeing and experiencing live today and over the past 2 years as the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the enormous leadership without government support from private sector all across the United States and across the world has shown us that this opportunity is not just a slogan, but it is reality, as factory after factory for batteries, for EVs, for wind and solar are created throughout the country and throughout the world to deliver on this moment, provides enormous economic opportunity. So I think from the urgency of the moment and the opportunity of the moment that we're in, it couldn't be more clear. And for today, in today's discussion, how to build on that work and how to expand and accelerate that work is the real question. And so when the president came into office in the first couple of days, he turned to us in government, the whole of government, and said, we need to move out in unison with force to tackle climate change. He looked at every department in the United States government, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and gave us ambitious goals to go execute on. He turned to my office and said to us, in a few words, go electrify our vehicles, electrify our buildings and power them on clean energy, and go revitalize sustainability writ large. And move out fast. I'd like to see that report on my desk within 90 days. And what we then did was go provide that report for the president, in which he turned into an executive order, in which he made very clear targets for us, like, let's make sure that all light duty vehicles in the US government are zero emission vehicles and our purchase of them no later than the year 2027. So we'll be 100% by 2027. Let's do that for medium and heavy duty vehicles no later than 2035. And let's start climbing up that incline now, get to work and going to do that. And so between that and electrify our buildings and power them on clean energy, we as a federal government have been hard at work. And I'm happy to report today, in a time where, there are a lot of pledges out there, public sector and private sector, and in some cases, not a lot of action, in some cases, institutions really struggling with. How do I go deliver on this moment? Proud to say that the Biden administration is delivering on these pledges, have become action in really significant ways. And I'll share just a couple quick examples. One of those examples is, we're 2 years into the formalization of the president's sustainability plan, and we have 80,000 zero emission vehicles either in our inventory or on the way. We have 30,000 charging ports to power those vehicles either in our inventory or on the way. That is on par with any other corporate leader on this front. I think of Amazon often when I think of this, and their 100,000 vehicle pledge, for which they're 10,000 in. Great progress, great goal, really important. And the US government is, right there in the lead. When it comes to our power and moving to clean energy, we start basically at a base of 40% of clean energy, and that's powering the US government facilities and vehicles right now. We now have in a pipeline 20 new percentage points of clean power coming online over the next couple of years, on our way to making sure that's 100% no later than 2030. And we've been able to achieve things like the first ever 100% 24/7 carbon-free electricity tariff in the state of Arkansas, for which are now powering USG facilities. And then when it comes to our buildings, we are moved out and forced to go electrify our over 300,000 buildings that we have in our portfolio. And one great example of that is the largest building in the District of Columbia. I used to think it was the largest federal building in the District of Columbia, for which there are many, many federal buildings, which is the Ronald Reagan building. And recently found out it is actually the largest building in the District of Columbia, including larger than the Capitol, of course, and larger than the Washington Convention Center. And that building, the Ronald Reagan building, we announced with John Podesta, with my boss, Brenda Mallory, that it could be all electric, thanks in part to the IRA. And then we moved out and forth with buildings across the United States, doing the same thing, and not only making them electric, but innovating to make sure that they're, in some cases, when we're building on this, grid interactive. So we can work flexibly with the grid when it comes to our assets. So one last thing I would cite from an action perspective is that we've also moved out in force, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, on a program that the president calls Buy Clean, which is how do we catalyze markets for low embodied carbon materials like steel, cement, glass, asphalt. Really difficult to abate sectors. And moving in on the demand side, where the president just announced billions of dollars going to the makers of those products last week in a big DOE announcement. And then on the demand side here, federal government going out and purchasing those products. We have $4.5 billion that we're going out to purchase right now, live, low embodied cement, steel, et cetera. So manifest action in a time where it is deeply necessary. And we're seeking to build on that and accelerate, like I said. And this takes us to my final point about collective action and the group of us here today. What can we do? How do I work with the federal government? What's my role? I just wanted to say a quick word about that, is that, I think we're in a time where there are two vectors for our partnership. One is I have been the beneficiary, thanks to MR in part, and many others, and that the federal government has come to this game late, where folks like Google, Amazon, GM have moved out on their clean electricity goals, and we need to learn. We need to grow. We need to mature our capability quickly. And our corporate partners have been extremely generous with their time and with their lessons that they share with us, so we can go hit our goal. So I think where you've showing leadership in that in this arena, we'd love to connect with you, hear your stories, help utilize that as we work this together. And number two, as the world's largest buyer of goods and services at over $650 billion a year, in addition to low embodied concrete, steel, glass, and asphalt, we want to buy clean transition product from you. So we look forward to building out that supply base. And I think that's the other critical vector of opportunity here between partnership and purchasing. With that, I'd say, I hope this helps set the scene. I think this is a time, as President Biden reminds us, a time of enormous enormous concern and yet enormous opportunity, and working that opportunity with everyone here and the larger communities is what we need to be doing. So I'm grateful to be here today. I look forward to our conversation. Oh,
Thanks again for those opening remarks, Andrew. A couple of questions for you. I'm an optimist, much like you are, where there's a lot of concern, but there's a lot of opportunity. So on the opportunity side, you said on the vehicle side, 80,000 or so to date. But what is the potential of the number of vehicles overall by 2030, or and the amount of square feet of buildings that can be electrified? Give us that opportunity and potential.
yeah. On the vehicles front, we have over 640,000 vehicles in the federal fleet. So 80,000 is a very serious number, and the kind of acceleration that we need, and we have a ways to go. And that I think we're going to be at 100,000 plus over the next few years as we add to that. Looking for, I'd like us to be in a place, and I think we can be in a place where we set these goals and we exceed these goals. And vehicles is I think a market that's moving quite quickly to our favor, where there's a very high probability we might be able to do that. So that's on the vehicle front. On the facility front, it's another, and you think about it, I had the opportunity to live here in Washington, D.C., and it turns out, not surprisingly, that the federal government and our facilities are not only all around the country, but all around the world. So we've got opportunity in every region of the country on the facility front as we go seek to retrofit those buildings, as we seek to build new buildings, to be on the front end of that electrification. And as I shared with you, we have over 300,000 facilities in our real estate portfolio, and we're at the beginning of that. So that opportunity is very ripe and expansive.
Great. Andrew, I know your time is very precious, but thank you for these remarks and answering these questions. Like I said, we will come back to you frequently to get updates, but really the work you do and the administration's doing is commendable, and we thank you and wish you all the best.
My pleasure. Thank you for being able to join you today. Deeply appreciate it, MR.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring my co-host here, Sanjeev Joshipura. Sanjeev is the Executive Director of Indiaspora, and he'll be your host for much of this morning and afternoon. Welcome, Sanjeev.
Thank you, MR. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. What a great note to start this event on. Such an important conversation. We heard from Andrew, and then MR had a question. So a great start to the event, to our Western Hemisphere Climate Summit. I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C., and I'll be your MC for the rest of this event. We move on now to a moderated fireside chat on climate policy. And I'd like to introduce the facilitator of the chat, Claire Shakya, who is the Global Managing Director at the Nature Conservancy. She's joining us from Oxford in the UK. And I'm delighted to welcome you, Claire, because the UK, a couple of reasons. The UK is an important country for Indiaspora. We have a strong network of leaders there that we connect with on a regular basis. But also, we've actually worked with Oxford on a couple of different occasions, held a couple of different events with them. And so I'm just delighted to welcome someone that lives in that part of the world. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. And really excited to be here as well. Realize that we're spanning a few time zones, so it's quite early for some people, but appreciate for all of those that have made it. And I'd like to invite my two fellow panelists to introduce themselves. First of all, Ritvika, who is the CEO of Swaniti. Ritvika, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. And thank you to everyone for joining in. Really appreciate it. And good to see you, Aparna. I'm Ritvika, and I'm the CEO for Swaniti Global Initiative. We are an ecosystem enabler. working towards a sustainable future in a climate-constrained world. That's a bunch of big and fancy words to say that we are working both at a community level as well as with private sector to unlock essentially government funding in South Asia and East Asia. We also have some work in the US. And our theory of change essentially focuses on saying that if we're able to leverage the strengths of the government by resources and private sector and civil society by the models that they replicate on energy transition, then we can work in an all hands on deck approach to fast track energy transition. So that's kind of a bit of the work that we do. And my role as CEO is to make sure that we have the strategic partnerships and the right people within the team to execute on these programs where we work on mission mode on a timeline to deliver.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be in this fireside chat with you. So also, if Aparna, if you could also give a few minutes introduction to you and your current role, your experience.
Yeah, thanks. So hey everybody, I'm Aparna Srivastava. So I work as the Deputy Chief Climate Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, also known as the DFC. So we are basically the U.S. government's development bank, and we're mandated to partner with the private sector to address the most pressing challenges facing the world. And climate is a huge, huge area of priority. As Andrew was just mentioning, the U.S. government has really been employing a whole of government approach to addressing the climate crisis, and DFC is very much the tip of the spear when it comes to international climate finance. So I joined DFC just about 3 years ago, towards the start of the administration. There was no climate office before I joined, and so I've worn a number of hats since joining, but really ultimately it's all been with the aim of increasing DFC's climate finance, thinking through strategies, partnerships, kind of how we're managing our investment pipeline, how we're thinking about growth, whether that's kind of in specifically just dollars or looking at kind of various subsectors or regions. So happy to talk more about that in this conversation. But in terms of my background, I studied mechanical and environmental engineering many years ago, and then ended up in I was very, very interested in international development, and so found myself specifically working across a number of different NGOs in India, in Uganda, Kenya, and a few other countries, starting out primarily in water and sanitation, but then moving into public health, agriculture, and a few other areas. And ultimately, it was pretty impossible to be working in international development without recognizing the massive elephant, not even in the room, but that just was the entire room. That was climate. That was really kind of hitting on all sorts of sectors and impacts that we were trying to have when it came to sustainable development. And so that's kind of what nudged me to move kind of entirely into the climate space and climate finance specifically. So yeah, very, very pleased to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. And from that background, you can I can sense that we've got sort of quite different experiences, really, in terms of the sort of locus of attention. So I guess if we just focus to start with on how you're seeing the challenges. We're at this particular point now where the climate impacts are very real and compounding. Climate finance is still hard to access, and there's an awful lot of the world where the large finance flows are still going towards the wrong things, towards more fossil fuel exploitation or use, and towards things that degrade nature. So whilst the big flows are in the billions, the effective flows that are going to support more effective action and get communities really able to set their vision is still not there. So maybe I could ask both of you just to reflect briefly on what the challenges are that we need to really tackle immediately. Ritrika, do you want to start again, or?
Sure, absolutely, happy to. So I think, the fascinating thing about where we are with, if I can frame it broadly as like the climate discussion, is, we had our phase of awareness and kind of knowledge building of the fact that this was a real crisis coming up. It's transitioned to a lot of government policy and a lot of governments now setting net zero targets. where I think as I see it every day, the fundamental problem now is becoming in how do you operationalize this? I don't think the fact that climate is an urgent issue and is the call of this generation or the crisis of this generation is anyone is going to question that. But what does a world where we're addressing these challenges effectively look like, I think is the biggest bottleneck. What I mean by that is, let's just take the example of a lot of the communities where we work are coal mining communities. And so whether it's US or whether it's India or whether it's Indonesia, we're trying to work with communities to understand what does a post-coal community look like? What are the job opportunities? What are the demographies going to look like? What will happen to the assets which exist in there? What is going to essentially look like the future of the people who are living there? And honestly, I think we're still trying to grapple what that looks like. And so it's more now, it's becoming a reality by way of implementation. And where I think we all grapple with is we theoretically understand what are the things that need to be done. What we're, as Swaniti, our kind of big focus is to now say, okay, well, if we do these things, this is what tangibly a successful future for you looks like. And that's where I think a big daunting question comes in, because climate is also like a very cross-cutting issue. And there are so many different facets we're dealing with. We're dealing with finance, we're dealing with equity, we're dealing with land use. Like there are just so many different floating pieces. And I think that, in the opening piece, I've talked about all hands on deck to make it tangible, to make it something which you can really kind of wrap your head around and something that needs to be wrapped around in terms of the next, 15, 20 years. We need to make it that much more real. And I think, if I can, Aparna, refer to your quote, that's not the elephant in the room, that is the room.
Thanks. And Aparna, how would you see the set of challenges we're facing?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest one, I guess wouldn't come as a surprise given that I'm aware, but truly I think is just looking at the financing gaps. So if you look at kind of the reports, even whether it's from the climate policy initiatives, global landscape on climate finance, or kind of the various resources that have come out in the last 6 months, what is promising is that there is a lot more financing flowing, which is a good thing, but it is nowhere nearly enough. I think we're looking at only having roughly 10 to 15% of kind of what anticipated investment needs are actually being projected to be filled if we follow the current trajectory. And that is something that we really, 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 really need to get ahead of, because I think especially when you're thinking about the more that we do now to mitigate GHGs getting into the atmosphere, or kind of building up the resilience, it is that much less that kind of has to happen in the future. And so just making sure that we're being as proactive as possible is really, really quite critical. So I think it's great that there is more financing flows, but ultimately the other kind of nuance that we have to keep in mind is that there's not nearly enough private sector capital. So there is, like, with everybody combined in terms of public budgets, there is no balance sheet large enough in the public sector that will be large enough to finance the clean energy transition, that will be able to finance kind of the community-based resilience needs that exist, and that will continue to grow as this crisis unfolds. And so really looking at how we can be crowding in more private sector capital into this space, I think is just really, really critical. And in some models, it's already happening, right? If you look at kind of how the cost curves of renewables has steadily been coming down and is now across the board a more cost competitive investment in the long run compared to kind of fossil infrastructure. While that is true, and while there is kind of financing flowing to those areas, when you look at it from kind of a full economy perspective, right, looking at all of the different sectors that are being impacted by this crisis, whether that is food security or water security or electric mobility or kind of clean energy manufacturing supply chains, right? It's really there's opportunities in nearly every sector of the economy, and nearly all of them could use more capital to actually be able to scale with the speed that they need to, and also in the communities, right? I think Ritvika, I really appreciated just learning more about kind of how your organization has been working on this and kind of really centering kind of community interests. Because I think while the financing flows are important to track kind of at a higher level, they have to also be that they also have to be flowing in a way that makes sense for the communities that they're impacting and looking to improve. I think currently, if you look at the stats, I think aggregate numbers, we're looking at least 90% of financing is either coming from public budgets and or going primarily to the global north. And so looking at how can we really equip the populations that are most vulnerable and kind of really on the front lines is just super essential. But I think it's important. It's not just a challenge, it's a tremendous opportunity.
Okay, well, that's a good moment to start looking at what do you see as the solutions? What should we be focusing on? And I don't know, do we go in the same order? Ritvika, do you want to go first, or Aparna, do you want to jump in and get there first?
So that's good. I'll go ahead. I do think, so I'll just pick up where Aparna left off. I do think that finance is definitely going to be the immediate need for solutions. So there's definitely like I'd say a list. I wouldn't even put it as a hierarchy. There's a list of solutions that need to be responded to. So one is definitely the fact that what does financing of this look like? And I think there is, as much as there's a global conversation happening on this, there's also a need for countries to look inward in terms of what resources are. So I think one of the things, if you look at like India and Indonesia come in, because I've worked there most, but essentially if you look at a lot of the conversation, a lot of it is also dependent on what is coming in externally. I know in India, for example, there's a lot of government programs which do actually feed in really well into the climate discussion. And can actually fund a lot of the especially rural movement toward more agricultural friendly practices, more kind of seed funding for green economies. But so much of the financing discussion is about fund flows which will come in from the global north. And I think there needs to be kind of a reframing of what the possibilities are. The JETP is kind of nudging a lot of the countries to look, South Africa and Indonesia, to look inward and say, what are the possible funding sources from within the country? But I don't know if there's enough thinking or enough framing of that, which is necessarily nudging countries to think that way. With that being said, again, echoing Aparna's point, I do think finance is going to be the immediate pressing piece, which is there. In light of finance, I think, we might be missing some of the key points of what is so important and what really makes this movement stand out, which is the focus on equity. Unlike a lot of other movements, climate movement has at the center talked about just transition and the fact that equity is at the core of what this movement is. And so how do you tie in what the values and the ethos of this particular conversation has been with equity, with inclusiveness, and make sure that financing is tied to that, or I think the more nuanced challenges which are there. And so if you're looking at financing private sector, how do you bring that conversation in? And as we're building out the solution, we need to be mindful of the fact that this has to be a more nuanced solution depending on the context as well as the stakeholder. And so even if we're talking about government policies going forward, to enable certain industries to decarbonize at a faster pace, what is going to be built in by way of equity? So I think the solution, definitely the orientation towards looking at how do you release more resources for a transition from like not just from an external funding perspective or funding coming from the global north perspective, but also from what is possible in country. And then the second is maintaining the ethos of what needs to be there for equity and inclusion.
Great. And Aparna?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'll start by sharing one of the things that has been just really energizing and motivating for our office is actually being able to track some of the progress we've been able to grow, we've been able to make in terms of growing our portfolio for climate. So when we joined in 2021, DFC that year committed just about $400 million in climate-related investments globally. And this was certainly exciting, but we were really keen on ensuring that we could grow that as much as possible. And last year, we actually we committed over 3.7 billion in climate investments, and that is just over the last 3 years that we've been able to do that. And one of the big ways that we really did that, and I think I touched upon this a little bit earlier as well, was first of all, recognizing that we really needed a whole of agency approach, and that meant helping the agency recognize across every single investment team that climate is a consideration to be made and an opportunity to consider when you're looking at kind of various potential investment risks or impacts, and just kind of opportunities for DFC to do more to build the resilience or kind of address kind of GHG emissions. And so that has been something that's been really exciting, is just kind of really taking a whole of agency, but what that also means is looking at every single sector and looking at truly every single investment that's coming through our pipeline from the lens of, okay, how can this be more climate aligned to push more? And so yeah, just figuring out how we can scale, how we can continue to scale is a big part of, I think, our day-to-day. But I think one thing for me personally that has been interesting to think about is, okay, it's good that we are having really encouraging results when it comes to the volume of our investments, but we're also now working on a strategy refresh for our climate investments that's specifically looking at how diversified our portfolio is, both by region, but also by sector. And looking at, okay, what are the underinvested sectors that need more capital to be able to kind of catalyze and get to the point that they can actually attract private capital themselves, whether that's kind of, for example, green hydrogen or battery storage on the energy side, in infrastructure, looking at water and sanitation, looking at nature-based solutions, and kind of across the board, really looking at, okay, it's great that we have kind of these larger numbers that we're working with in terms of our investment volumes, but how can we really make sure that our impact is as kind of diversified as possible and really kind of catalyzing more and more impact? I think I'll just add that the two areas that I think I personally am really eager to have DFC do more in, and I'm hoping to see more and more opportunities. One is in adaptation and resilience, and specifically looking at how to really anchor as much of our work in building community level resilience as possible. And the second is in nature-based solutions. DFC has actually been kind of forging a path alongside some key partners for some innovative transactions on for debt for nature swaps, as they're known. So there's a Belize blue bond, and also one that was issued in Galapagos that has been a really, really innovative and impactful transaction that has basically been able to refinance and restructure sovereign debt in countries, and basically the savings for that is then directed towards conservation activities that are run by local, kind of a locally established trust with local leaders in support. And so, yeah, there's a lot more work to be done, but I think there's actually some really, really interesting opportunities to dig in on.
It's a great example, and it nicely brings together actually the points you've both been making about the need to make this real in specific context, and look at what the interventions could be that actually meet community needs and create jobs and future wealth as well. One of the questions we've been asked in the chat, I realize that we're running out of time, so I'm just moving us on to questions, and I'll give you both an opportunity just to sort of finish with one sentence finishing at the end. But one of the questions we've been asked in the Q&A is around, with corporate profits soaring in the US, what do you feel the responsibilities and obligations of the corporations are to tackle climate change, not just in their own business operations, but in terms of equity between the financially rich global north and the developing global south? And that seemed to speak very strongly to both of your comments. So any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly, I think everybody has a responsibility, no matter kind of what hat they're wearing, but especially when it comes to kind of entities that do have so many resources available to them. 100%. The one example that comes to mind that might be interesting to look into is the Justice 40 initiative that was launched at the beginning of the administration, that's specifically targeting, it's more domestically oriented, but really looking at how to ensure that financial flows are actually reaching historically marginalized communities within the US.
And just really quickly, thank you for that question. I think that's a very fair question. And I think one of the things that the framework right now does not necessarily extend itself for companies in the global north to necessarily do as much. And what I mean by that is, again, I'll take the example of Indonesia. One of the things that they're looking at is, can we look at decarbonizing large industries in this country, in Indonesia, and within that, can some of the big players, especially like the Adidas and the Nike, be the first to decarbonize and set the example? One framework which is interesting and worth looking into is, instead of just focus on the countries which are headquartered in the global north, can we look at the supply chain of MSMEs that they're linked to also decarbonize them? And so this is something which in that country context has just been really interesting, and how the government is trying to frame that discussion and look at supply chains and link that to companies in the global north. But I think that's just one framework of what the possibilities are by way of responsibilities and how they can act on that. So I do think the potential for that is a lot. At this point, I do think both industry association, industries, and policymakers need to start to look at what the plethora of solutions can exist to actually have them respond more accountably.
Okay, so I'm running out of time very fast, and I want to give you both.
Claire, if you don't
Sorry.
mind, sorry, this is Sanjeev again. Just one quick question, if I might interject very, very quickly.
Sure.
This is from one of our Indiaspora members in Houston, Texas, Dhiren Shetia, and he asked the question. It's in the chat box, but I'll read it out loud for everyone's benefit. Great panel, thanks. It is quite clear now that both the private and the public sectors, due to political uncertainty globally, are wavering to meet the financial requirements for energy transition. Can you share your thoughts in prioritization of the transition, that is technologies, regions, etc., in light of this practical reality? Thanks. Just earlier today, Claire, just for context, I was speaking with someone from another climate organization, and we were talking about England, as a matter of fact, and how both political parties in England are, debating and sort of scaling back a little bit on their climate pledges. So that's just one case in point among many. But go ahead.
Yeah, Sanjeev, a very difficult issue indeed when countries start to roll back, including as we're seeing in the UK. So Ritvika, Aparna, any thoughts on actually how do we prioritize when finance is insufficient? And I guess this really speaks to that issue of justice that came up in the earlier question as well. Is there a way we can think about this so that we are, the problem with the energy transition is we need to do all of it all at once and very fast.
Yeah, precisely. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Go, Aparna. Yeah.
Just a few quick thoughts. I mean, I think when it comes to the mitigation side, I think it's a little bit easier to look at how to think of a prioritization framework, specifically looking at kind of what has the most potential in terms of lowering, basically the cost of dollar per ton removal of CO2 from looking at different technologies, and that kind of varies from one sector to the other, from one region to the other. But obviously anything in renewables, we're actually in the midst of a really robust analysis specifically of how we can look at kind of prioritization across these spaces. And I think one of the biggest areas that we've seen of opportunity in Asia, for example, is just really focusing in on diversifying clean energy supply chain, and specifically manufacturing of various components. And so I think in that region, for example, on the mitigation side, that's a huge area. There's also tremendous need, for example, for baseload technology, whether that's green hydrogen or basically non-carbon intensive baseload that can really kind of ensure that grids are able to transition. One of the examples that you'll see is in Kenya. Kenya's grid is over 90% renewables, and that is thanks to their well-developed geothermal resource in the Great Rift Valley. And so On the mitigation side, I think there's some clear ways of analysis. On the adaptation side of the coin, I think there's kind of important considerations around which countries are most vulnerable and kind of least able to adapt given their own kind of constraints. And I think we're still kind of getting to the bottom of that analysis. But Claire, I know that you have worked on this for years, so I'd also invite if you wanted to share some thoughts.
Yeah, well, it's. I mean, there are some obvious countries that just by the fact that they don't have very much budget themselves are really struggling to, and they're small markets, so they struggle to attract the private finance. So small island developing states, least developed countries all seem to struggle more to bring in the private investment that's needed. So definitely needs a bit more support from the public investors or from the development financial institutions. Ritvika, I'm going to give you the opportunity to give the final word from a bottom-up perspective, given we've really run over time now.
Oh, no pressure there. No, but thank you so much. And Darren, shout out to you because I'm also based out of Houston, so I'm going to try and close this with a comment up from your side. I think the biggest issue I'd say is the narrative that we're following, and this is my 30-second pitch. I think the narrative is still so much around urgency as opposed to opportunity, and I think Claire, you opened with this. If we can reframe the narrative to talk about the fact that I think I'd heard a while back the climate movement being described as being at the precipice of the new industrial revolution. And I thought that was a great framing. And if we frame this as an urgent need to be at the precipice of the new industrial revolution, I think we have the opportunity to grow that much more. As opposed to playing catch up, we're actually leading the way. And if we reframe the narrative, the politics of it actually follows in through the narrative. So I do think there's a need to reframe where we are with the climate narrative. That's my closing comment, and I know we're 3 minutes over, so I'll go ahead and
that's a great way to close us off. Thank you so much, and thank you both for joining, and to Indiaspora for having this panel. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, Ritvika, and Aparna. My favorite part about organizing Indiaspora events is that I get to attend them and listen to people like you engage in such substantive conversations. So really do appreciate your panel. We'll move on now to our next segment, and it is my tremendous honor and pleasure to now introduce Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. She is the chairperson of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. She's joining us, I believe, from Dar es Salaam, and she's also the former chief scientist of the World Health Organization. Indiaspora had the pleasure of working with Soumya. Well, pleasure is perhaps not the appropriate choice of word, although it was an honor to work with you, Soumya, during COVID, during the height of COVID, when the world so desperately needed your expertise and your organization's leadership. And, I recall several frantic and, tense conversations where we were trying to do work together. It's just such a privilege to welcome you back to our event here virtually today, Soumya. And the floor is yours for your keynote remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sanjeev and MR and Indiaspora. I've been listening to the excellent talks that came just before. The title of my talk today is that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. And I want to make the case, and I think probably everybody on this call probably already guesses that women are disproportionately impacted compared to men when it comes to climate impacts. But before that, the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report of 2023 identified in the top 10 risks, there were 5 environmental risks. But if you look at their 10-year horizon, then 7 out of the 10 risks that they foresee are environmental in nature, biodiversity loss, natural disasters, failure to mitigate, as well as failure to adapt to climate change and large-scale environmental damage. Now, I'm not going to repeat a lot of the basic facts that we already know, but it's quite looking at what happened in 2023, which was the first year that we actually got to the 1.5 degree warming limit that the world had set in Paris that we would try not to cross. I think we had the greatest number of and scale of natural disasters all around the world with floods, droughts, wildfires, etc. And it's clear that the hazards, the climatic hazards to people's health and well-being are only increasing day by day, and that while it's impacting people all over the world, clearly those who are already at the margins cannot take these shocks. And it's the same thing in COVID. You mentioned, Sanjeev, that countries and people who are better resourced are able to bounce back from the shocks. Whereas if you're on the edge, then it's very difficult to bounce back. And it may be that one final push and then you're back down into poverty, as well as food deprivation, which is what's predicted. Now, in terms of the impacts on health, we know it can have direct impacts like temperature extremes and floods, droughts, windstorms, wildfires, and very importantly, ambient air pollution. And then on the indirect side, of course, through the food system, through declining yields, through declining micronutrients in crops, impacting nutrition, impacting water systems as well. We know groundwater is getting depleted in many parts of the world, an increase in vector-borne diseases, malaria and dengue spreading into areas where the mosquitoes could not previously survive. And essentially, again, just like COVID, climate is exacerbating social determinants and inequities. Now, in what ways are women worse off? Partly it's because, again, of the intersectionality. It's not that all women are worse off, but when their gender intersects with poverty, with cultural norms, with the kind of roles and responsibilities that women have to cook and feed the family, etc., then you find that the burden is definitely disproportionately higher on them. Now, according to the UNDP, women and children are 14 times more likely than men to die in a disaster. When there's crop failure, there's food insecurity. Again, it's women's job to feed their families. They have to go out and do something to feed their children. There's more agricultural work as men migrate, leaving women to take care of the fields at home. Again, women provide water for the households. And so with water scarcity, women have to probably walk longer distances to look for that water. Whenever there are natural disasters or conflicts, we know that there is increased violence against women. And there's a lot of data now that when areas are subject to recurrent droughts, that intimate partner violence increases significantly. With more time spent on things like providing for food and water for the households, there's less time for women to take care of themselves, or to access healthcare, or in fact, in their caregiving responsibilities. Again, a large part of the world still does not have clean energy for household needs like cooking and heating. And again, it's women who go out to collect firewood and biomass. And not only do they spend a lot of time collecting it, but then it also impacts their health because they're inhaling the fumes. And so women are face double the burden of pollution, indoor air pollution because of biomass, and outdoor air pollution or ambient air pollution, which is, of course, impacting everybody. And again, displacement, forced migration, that also increases women's vulnerability. Now, in a review of 130 studies globally that was done by Nithya Rao et al., 2/3 of these studies showed that women and girls face disproportionately higher health risks due to climate change, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's death and injury from extreme weather, whether it is mental illness, and of course, reproductive and maternal health issues. Now, we could talk about the impacts, of heat waves. And recently, there was a study that came out of South India, which showed that exposure to high heat, especially when women are also physically working outdoors, does result in a higher risk of abortions, of stillbirths, and of premature birth and babies being born too small, and also an impact on the woman's health in terms of increased risk of preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy. Again, we know that young children and older people, so older women, are much more vulnerable to heat stress, and particularly when these are low-income families living in urban areas with the urban heat island effect. And the Met Department has been actually putting out warnings for India as well as the whole of South Asia that this year we're likely to have very prolonged heat. And when you combine heat with humidity, then what's called the wet bulb temperatures, if they go above 30, and certainly if they go above 35 degrees, then this is kind of incompatible with life. So there are many places in the world, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where the temperatures and humidity combination is already reaching a point where it's threatening to lives. And so again, we still understanding what the biology is, but there's a terrific strain on cardiovascular system, for example. And if it's prolonged and there's no relief, like if you can't afford air conditioning so that your body doesn't get a chance to cool down at night, then we could start seeing much higher mortality as well. So the implications on women's health go all the way from birth, sexual maturation. It's believed that girls attain early menarche. Infertility is higher. We talked about the pregnancy complications. There are changes in milk composition for lactating women. And then there's also changes during menopause, like early menopause and so on. And again, as I mentioned, if there's intersectionality of poverty or of being a woman from an indigenous or a tribal community, then all of these risks and threats are heightened. Now, I want to turn to not looking at women as just victims and talking about, this is what is happening to women, and unfortunately, this is it. But really looking to turn that around into how women can actually be agents of change, because we know that women are first-line responders. Whether it's the mother in the household or whether it's a community health worker, these are invariably women. And they are the ones who actually do all of the work. We saw during COVID, for example, the people who went out, did the vaccination without really thinking about their own health, were community health workers, what are called ashas in India, and village health nurses and so on. So we have to start looking to see if women are the first responders, then how do we equip them, and how can we make policy, and how do we get the resources and the support for women to be able to understand what's happening, to be able to track in their very communities what is happening. That's what we'll be really focusing on adaptation. And I think it was mentioned earlier that a lot of the funding, as it is, there's inadequate funding going into this area, but most of the funding so far has been on mitigation, on the energy transition and so on transport, and thinking about those things rather than adaptation. And it's already too late. So we really need to make sure that there's funding that goes into adaptation, but also there's a lack of gender sensitivity in our plans. We need to look at policy, and I just want to make a few points maybe to conclude, and then we could open it up for discussion. But the first thing is that a lot of the policy making does not involve women. It doesn't involve community-based organizations. It doesn't involve grassroots organizations. And therefore, it's quite gender blind, really. We really need to start thinking about the different forms of discrimination that are experienced by women. And that's the only way we could include a broad range of human rights and gender considerations as we're trying to build climate resilience. Secondly, we have to ensure that full, equal, and meaningful participation of women, and with diverse backgrounds, both in disaster risk reduction and in climate change mitigation and adaptation. In fact, an example is the representation at COP, country delegations, how many of them are really women. We need to look at things like women's rights to land, natural and financial resources, have decisive measures related to climate-induced displacement, and address and prevent sexual and gender-based violence in the context of climate change. Again, we need to look to make sure that all relevant bodies and processes, whether it's under the UNFCCC or whether it's under disaster risk reduction, they must ensure gender responsive mitigation and adaptation. And we need disaggregated data collection. This is a problem in many countries, and we don't have disaggregated data collection coming from different departments and ministries. It's very hard to make the case or to have the evidence of how women or men are being impacted differently. So we need to have gender-specific indicators, and we need to do more research, really looking at the effects of climate change upon women, men, girls, boys, poor, rural, remote communities, people with disabilities, LGBTQI, etc. We need more community-based vulnerability and capacity assessments, and conduct gender assessment needs pre and post disasters. And finally, when it comes to policy, then I think we need to look at or review all our current policies. For example, in India, we have a national action plan on climate change, and every state has a state action plan on climate change. And when we've looked at these plans, we find that there are very few of them that are even what could be called gender sensitive or gender responsive. And where we really want them to be is gender transformational. So this could be done only if we have gender focal points in climate and disaster ministries and agencies that have some specific gender training and are tasked, with gender mainstreaming. So we need a lot of capacity building, especially for these groups that make these policies and plans. Of course, we know that the response here needs to be multi-sectoral, so it has to be an all-of-government response. It can't be done by one or two ministries. We need a more capacity building and training at different levels. And as I mentioned, particularly at the community level, I think we have women's groups now that are really active and are quite empowered, and they could be used, or they could be given the further tools and resources needed so that they can take care of their own communities. So maybe I'll stop there, Sanjeev, and see if anybody has any comments or questions.
Actually, Soumya, as it turns out, there are questions. I'm seeing questions in the chat box. I had a question of my own as well. If you don't mind, what we'll do is we are running, considerably behind time, and there's a couple of speakers as well that are lined up that have, other urgent appointments to get to as well. So we might not be able to ask you questions live, if that's okay. What we will do, Soumya, is collate a couple of questions for you, send them to you via email, and if you don't mind responding to us, we'll disseminate the answers to the relevant people. Yeah, if that's fine.
Yeah,
but really
that's fine.
Appreciate you making the time to join us from Dar es Salaam in the middle of your travels. And always great to reconnect. Looking forward to more connection when you come over potentially to the United States later this year. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Sanjeev. Thank you.
Thank you, Soumya. We'll now move on to our next speaker. And we have coming up a TED-style talk entitled From Crisis to Hope, Africa's Promising Climate Narrative. And joining us is Nassima Sadar-Gravier, who is the founder and CEO of Afroclimate and also an Obama Fellow. And Nassima, I believe you're joining us from Mauritius. Is that correct?
Exactly. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let me just share my screen. First of all, I would like to really thank the team of the Indiaspora network to giving me the opportunity to be part of this important conversation and of this important climate summit. It's an honor for me to also represent the voice of Africa to share a perspective from the continent. So, as introduced by Sanjeev, I'm Nassima Sadar-Gravier. I am from Réunion Island. For those of you who don't know where is Réunion Island, it's a small island located in the Indian Ocean, just between Mauritius and Madagascar. As you can see, it's a beautiful island. The island was created by a volcano, and we are lucky to still have the volcano active. Once a year, we have an eruption, which is not dangerous. We can even go and visit it. And for the story, my grandfather is the first generation of Indian who have moved from Gujarat to Reunion Island. 15, that's a number that for me represents the first part of my professional life. I'm an investment professional. I worked in private equity and I worked for family offices in Paris, in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Singapore, Australia, before I moved in Mauritius 10 years ago. And for 5 years, I was a private equity partner in a small PE firm investing in East Africa. 2019, that's when I became a mom for the first time. And soon after that I became a mom, I also had my climate awakening. I realized during my maternity that by 2050, and everyone's talk about 2050, my son will be only 31 years old, and that it will be quite a rough time for this generation to be that young at that time and simply to be there. And just after my son turned 1 year old, we all knew and we got hit by the pandemic, COVID-19, and it really shook the world entirely. It was something new, but I'm sure that all of you are also very familiar with this picture of what was coming even bigger than the climate crisis, than the pandemic, with the climate crisis. So I decided to be part of my solution, and I left my corporate life, and I decided to launch 2 ventures. As an investor, I set it up with 3 co-founders, a business angel network, to support the startup. And we have been investing actively on the African continent. It's not only about investing our money, it's also about sharing our expertise and also our network. Today, we have a community of 40 active members. And I transitioned my professional life more because I really wanted to be part of the climate solution. And I joined a co-founder in Singapore, and we created a consulting firm to really help the corporate companies to reduce their carbon footprint simply by helping them to use innovation. So we scoped for the best climate startup in the US, in Europe, and in Southeast Asia. And we would help those companies to reduce their food waste or to work on their energy efficiency. And after 3 years, I really felt, gratitude, the feeling of really what it means to impact positively the people, but also the environment, and particularly in the region where I am from. In 2022, I had my second son. And funny for the story, every time that I have a baby, I take another direction or I go even deeper, but now I'm good with 2. So in 2023, when my son was 1 year old, my work, those 2 functions got recognized, and I became an Obama leader. I followed a leadership program of 6 months with the Obama Foundation. And during this leadership program, I took time to reach out to the other Obama leaders because I really wanted to understand why they were motivated by the work that they were doing. And this is where my life transitioned again, because I reached out to some of them to understand some entrepreneurs who had developed solution, people that work for companies putting solar panel, but in parallel, they would develop rural solution in a small container with PV solar and with water treatment, a solution that would simply cost $30,000 US, and that would give access to 40,000 people water access daily. And I asked to Chad what pushed him to develop that solution. And then he started to share with me data about the cholera epidemic in his country. During that same 6 months, there was also, I started to deep dive into the climate injustice in Africa, and I discovered that Africa is 1.2 billion people, but this population is only contributing to 4% of the global greenhouse gases emission. During that same period, going back to this figure, sorry, this population in 2050 will represent a quarter of the world population. And these Africans, they're like us, they also want to consume, to have a phone, to use technology. And if we don't help them to do so in a sustainable manner, I believe that all the effort that we're all trying to do today to really do our part will not make any sense, because these greenhouse gases emission might explode. During that same period, while I was really doing those research, I ended up realizing what was really the injustice of climate in Africa. A third of the African population do not have access to water today. And we've just heard how it affects Africa. 86 million Africans will probably have to migrate by 2050. Close to 250 million still do not have access daily. And even if energy might not be a consequence of climate change, still half of the Africans today do not have access to electricity daily. During that same period, there was a cyclone called Freddy. And for the first time of my life, as an islander, I've never seen a cyclone that came all the way from Asia to our region. Usually a cyclone would be here for a week and that's it. Or after 10 days, it will die. This cyclone lands for 5 weeks. And even worse, when it reached Mozambique, it even went back. I've never seen that before. And the strength of that cyclone was about 250, 300 kilometers. So it was very strong. And for me, this was a sign that climate change was even real. So when I started to be realizing that the climate was really an injustice in Africa, it put me down for several weeks. And I also came across that statistic that 69% of the wildlife population worldwide and about 40% over the last 40 years of the biodiversity in Africa has been fallen. And if we realize these figures, if we continue at that rate, in fact, we might all ended up struggling even more, not because of the climate crisis, but because of the loss of the biodiversity. But again, there is hope. And this is, for example, the solution of Chad, the other Obama leaders, giving access to 40,000 people, access to water and to electricity. Here, you also see two other solutions in Nigeria. On one hand, it's an entrepreneur who have developed clean cook stove to really help people stop cutting trees or to use charcoal, which is not good for their health. This startup was smart enough to even sell carbon credits. And he used those carbon credits not to have dividends within his company, but really to offer for free clean cook stove to the low-income communities. On the other hand, you have another startup still in Nigeria where they would encourage vulnerable population to collect waste, and in exchange of waste, they will offer them health cover, particularly for women who are about to give birth, or for families to go and to buy malaria pills at the pharmacy. Here you have two other examples of startup in Kenya. One who has developed a solution for fishermen, because those fishermen, if they were not able to store their fishes, they would just throw them away. So they have developed their own freezer with solar panel. And on the other side, it's another startup that is working with fishermen to really help them to fish sustainably and opening market for them. Those two startups, for example, the one on the left, over a year, they were able to increase the income of the fishermen by 50%. the other one on the right, over here, they were able to increase the income of the fishermen by 188%. But these startups, they are not unicorns. They are never going to be a billion-dollar company because their first mission is really to impact positively people. They are what we call Debras. And Debra, you need to breed them. You need to help them. These entrepreneurs, they are looking for support really of people like you and I that can come and that can share with them expertise, industrial people, for example, that will really help them to improve the way that they process their manufacturing operation, to connect them with suppliers, to open them, to connect them with even more communities for them to collaborate with these communities. They also need media visibility. If tomorrow we come and we have the opportunity to showcase to the world the positive impact that they have on the vulnerable communities, this is surely a way that will also help them to raise even more grant monies. And we realized by working over a short period of 8 months that the 7 startups we've been working with, not only they were having solutions that would help to fight the climate crisis, that would improve the life of the local communities, but that will also able to mitigate the loss of biodiversity because they were already working with NGOs or community-based conservation to really help them to also become more sustainable. So together with that vision, we were today a group of 25 experts from Africa and from Asia, from Europe, that joined together to share with them our expertise to really help to empower them, to really make a difference, to really bring the hope, because we have no choice to do it. So we took our responsibility here. And I will finish here just with a final thought for everyone. We all know that time is against us and that we have no choice than to adapt ourselves to climate change. Let's become accountable to each other, and let's make sure that any solution that will bring a positive change will not negatively impact someone else in another part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nassima. Really appreciate your presentation and the inspiring work that you're doing. So glad that we had the chance to listen to you, tell us about it. And thank you for joining us in the midst of an important event that I know you're at over there in Mauritius. So appreciate your time. We'll move on. Thank you. We'll move on now to another guest of ours. The trains are running a little bit behind schedule, but we do appreciate him waiting. And it's an honor and a privilege on behalf of M.R. Rangaswamy, myself, and all of the Indiaspora network to welcome Assistant Secretary Donald Liu. He is the Assistant Secretary of the South and Central Asia Bureau at the U.S. Department of State. We at Indiaspora have had the pleasure of interacting with Don on several different occasions, both in person as well as live, sort of via screens like this one, on different topics. As one might imagine, the U.S.-India relationship spans a gamut of different things. But today, Don is here to talk about shared challenges and collaborative solutions, the climate crisis through the U.S.-India lens. So, Don, we are awaiting your keynote address.
Hi, Sanjeev. Just checking if anybody can see me yet. I know my screen says still waiting for my video to load. And I must say, I'm feeling quite boring here listening to amazing speakers from Mauritius and Dar es Salaam. I'm beaming in from boring old Washington, D.C.
A city that has a lot of importance in the climate space, Don, as you well know. So,
I'm guessing you cannot see me because that's what my screen says, but I'm just going to go forth.
We can hear you loud and clear. Please go ahead, Don.
Great.
I think your video isn't on, is what my colleagues tell me who are manning the technical aspect of things. So if you don't mind turning it on your side, the video, and then we'll be able to see you. We can pin you on the main screen the moment you turn your video on.
Unfortunately, it says the host has stopped my video. But at any rate, let me just say my truth, and if we can get the video running, all the better. But it's mostly my words I want to share.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Oh, here we go. Amazing. So last year, nearly 180 people were killed in Sikkim as a result of flash floods. And these were caused by melting Himalayan glaciers. For me, it's a really stark example of the World Bank's prediction that over 800 million people in South Asia could face sharply diminished living conditions by 2050 as a direct result of climate change. And in India, as we know, 8 out of 10 people live in parts of India that are vulnerable to extreme climate events, such as droughts or floods or cyclones. I'm worried this is a sign of things to come, and that we in the United States, we must examine whether our actions today can still mitigate some of the worst effects of climate change around the globe. And I would argue there's no more important place in the world to consider this question than in India. Let me tell you what you already know, which is India's economy is surging. India is projected to more than double its power consumption by 2050. And the question really is whether India will be able to create sustainable economic growth in a way that is less damaging to the environment than the paths chosen by the United States or Europe or China. The answer to this question will determine whether we as a planet succeed or fail in meeting the challenge of this climate crisis. I know that Indians I talk to are counting on help from the private sector and from India's international partners to support Prime Minister Modi's ambitious target of 500 gigawatts of installed non-fossil fuel power capacity by 2030. And the United States is working together with India to support its rise as a global clean energy superpower. Many of you are joining from California. I was recently in Silicon Valley, and I had a glimpse of the future. A company called Bloom Energy is working with partners in India and around the world to create cleaner energy from a remarkable new technology. Some of you know K.R. Sridhar, a proud Indian American. K.R. used to work at NASA, and he helped design a process to convert electricity into gas to fuel future Mars missions. He later reverse engineered that same process to create electricity from gas, but without burning it. And it could be from any type of gas. It could be natural gas, it could be biogas, it could be hydrogen. The technology passes gas through a metal alloy and ceramic plates to create electricity, but I'm not a scientist, and to me, it looked a lot like magic. We have hundreds of companies around the United States that are working with Indian partners to figure out how to take technological innovations in both India and the United States and scale them up to produce clean energy that will fuel India's economic rise. For example, PowerPlug in New York is building hydrogen fuel cells that replace conventional batteries to power electric vehicles and other equipment in India and around the world. Fuel Cell Energy in Connecticut is designing and operating fuel cell power plants that harvest energy from solar and wind farms to ensure constant, reliable power day and night, winter and summer. There are also Indian companies that are leading the way on clean energy transition right here in the United States. I take the example of VSK Energy, which announced a $1.5 billion solar panel manufacturing operation in the United States that includes a major facility in Colorado. India's unprecedented efforts to expand green energy production will be propelled by technology and finance from around the world, but most importantly, from India itself. The Adani Group has announced 3 gigafactories to produce solar modules, wind turbines, and hydrogen electrolyzers as part of its $70 billion green energy initiative. Mukesh Ambani, not to be outdone, announced his vision that India will not only fulfill its own demand for power with green energy, but will also become a leading exporter of green energy around the world. His company, Reliance Industries, announced a $75 billion investment into renewable energy with the goal of ensuring that all of its worldwide operations will have net zero emissions by 2035. As India faces this enormous challenge and opportunity, I am confident that the United States will become its partner of choice. We have a great track record together. Together, Silicon Valley and Bangalore led a digital revolution that changed our world forever. Our companies have partnered together to make world-class pharmaceuticals, vaccines, and medical devices. The United States and India share a bond of being entrepreneurial people. America has led with cutting-edge research and a risk-taking startup culture. India offers tremendous scientific and human capital with its well-educated and young population. When I last worked in India about a decade ago, tech companies would often quote this statistic, which I know is still true today. The United States graduates 70,000 engineers a year. All of Europe combined, they graduate 100,000. But India graduates every year 1 million engineers. It's the sheer scale of India that ensures that it will be a powerhouse in every human endeavor. The U.S. Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, and Indian Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Hardeep Singh Puri, they met in Washington recently, and they declared that the U.S.-India partnership is the most important energy relationship in the world. This will be a momentous year in U.S.-India partnership, also on climate change. In addition to working together on our green energy transition goals, we are poised to launch this year the most expensive and sophisticated Earth imaging satellite ever in the history of mankind. It's called the NASA ISRO Synthetic Aperture Radar, or NISAR, satellite mission, and it cost both of our countries $1.5 billion. It will allow us to observe and measure some of the planet's most complex natural processes, including ecosystem disturbances, ice sheet collapse, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, and landslides. Our joint vision is that we will share this data with the world so all of us can better understand and mitigate the most serious consequences of climate change. For all of those reasons, India is our indispensable partner in fixing the planet. And for the world to be successful in combating climate change, the US and India will need to lead the way. And so again, we are proud to call India our greatest energy partner. Thanks everyone for letting me join you today.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Lou. Do you have, I know we are running a little bit behind and you have a tight schedule. Do you have time for one question?
Sure, as long as it's a really hard one.
This is one of the things I love about interacting with you. Always a witty remark at the ready. So Don, here's just one question that I have upon listening to your remarks. You know, when you're a veteran, seasoned, experienced diplomat, and I know you go to India and meet with your senior counterparts in India in the MEA there, the Ministry of External Affairs, and so on and so forth. What is their reaction like when you ask them the question about the inherent tensions between economic development and energy transition? You know, the example I often think about myself, just on a very practical basis, sort of a per capita basis, India is still a relatively poor country. And how do you explain to the person that owned a motorcycle before, that now wants to purchase a four-wheeler car, that you shouldn't do it because it's bad for the climate, right? I mean, how does one square that circle? What do the Indian officials tell you?
It's a great question. And really, I think for many Indians, there is a sense that, particularly in the West, that we have decided for India that India should pursue a slower growth trajectory in order that we can save the planet and not pollute the environment. That's anything but true. In fact, what we've seen now around the world is you do not have to sacrifice growth. You don't have to sacrifice really high quality and fast energy production by going after renewables. And nowhere is this more obvious, not in MEA, but with the Prime Minister's office. Prime Minister Modi is a true believer in renewable energy. You hear that from him all the time. There may be skeptics in India. He is not one of them. His pursuit of green hydrogen for India at scale is inspirational. We see nowhere else in the world where you get that sort of buy-in right from the top. So to my friends at MEA, I say, nobody wants to see India move faster than the United States. We are bought in to India's rise. India's rise is good for America, but we want it to rise in a way that is better than the way America rose. We rose on the back of coal-fired power plants, and if India does that, it will be bad for all of us. We can invest in India getting it right. Thank you, Sanjeev. Great to join all of you. What a terrific topic today.
Honored to have you here. Our pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll move on now to our next segment. It's a panel discussion, and it's on conservation and restoration of nature in the climate crisis. And moderating the session for us will be Sumedha Tanwar. Sumedha is joining us, I believe, from Geneva, where she is at the Trillion Trees platform at the World Economic Forum and is an alumnus of ISEC as well. Sumedha, just wanted to let you know that the last time Indiaspora was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, we did participate in conversations around the climate space. So unfortunately missed you at that time, but hopefully we'll run into you in person in the future when we come next. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. And thanks a lot for the introduction and for having us here at Indiaspora's Annual Climate Summit. It is truly an honor for me, and to those joining us live, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Sumedha, as Sanjeev mentioned, and I serve as a communication strategy and youth engagement specialist at the World Economic Forum's Trillion Trees platform, which is called 1t.org. So we have a great panel lined up with an incredible set of panelists that I will introduce in just a second. Firstly, we have Janie Bhavishi, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and Deputy NOAA Administrator. In this role, Janie is responsible for providing agency-wide direction with regards to climate resilience, fisheries, and coastal and ocean programs, including efforts related to NOAA's implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. Welcome, Janie. Our next panelist is Seema Paul, the Program Director at Sequoia Climate Foundation. I hope I pronounced that correctly, where she leads the grant-making portfolio for India. And prior to joining Sequoia, Seema successfully led the launch of 2 environmental startups in India, Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, and more recently, the Nature Conservancy. She has also worked in 2 philanthropic startups focused on climate change, Ted Turner's UN Foundation and Climate Works Foundation, as well as for international organizations such as UNAIDS. Welcome, Seema. Our next panelist is Monica Shukla, who is the founder and CEO of The Humble Bee. Recognized as a global shaper and GRIG for sustainability reporter, she was among the top 15 women entrepreneurs transforming India by Niti Aayog and the UN. Currently, Monica is on a mission to transform India's beekeeping landscape, where she aims to maximize hive productivity, reduce the gender divide, and unlock beekeeping as a low-barrier economic activity. Welcome, Monica. And completing our expert-studied panel is Dr. Radhika Khosla, Associate Professor at the University of Oxford and Research Director at Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development. Her research portfolio includes being the principal investigator of the Oxford Martin School's interdisciplinary and multi-country program on the future of cooling, which examines and helps shape the unprecedented increase in cooling energy demand growth and its relationship to the SDGs. Welcome, Radhika. With this, I am excited to kick off our discussion. And my first question is for you, Janie. Given your current role, what are the current principles that are guiding NOAA and the US government's conservation restoration efforts in context of the climate crisis? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Sumedha, for your warm introductions, and thank you to Indiaspora for putting together this amazing panel of women leaders in this space. So very proud to be a part of it. So NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is an active participant in the Biden administration's America the Beautiful initiative, which was started with President Biden's executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, which recognized the essential role of conserving biodiversity and addressing climate change. And in developing the America the Beautiful initiative, the federal government consulted with diverse stakeholders across the nation and developed 8 key principles that are guiding our response to the disappearance of nature, climate change, and inequitable access to the benefits of nature. I'm not going to go through all 8 principles just because I know we are short on time, but I wanted to highlight just a couple of them. One of the principles calls for federal agencies to pursue a collaborative and inclusive approach to conservation. The spirit of collaboration and shared purpose is meant to embody all aspects of America's nature conservation and restoration efforts over the next decade. We're also working to conserve America's lands and waters for the benefit of all people, to make sure that we are not thinking about a particular place in solely biological terms, but also its capacity to provide benefits such as access to recreation and preparing for and responding to climate change impacts. We're supporting locally led and locally designed conservation efforts and pursuing conservation and restoration approaches that create jobs and support healthy communities. So I might leave it at that just for the sake of time, but I hope that gives you a flavor.
Thanks a lot, Janie. Just following up a bit on that, how would you say is NOAA collaborating with other federal agencies across the US government to address the science and knowledge for effectively conserving biodiversity?
Well, NOAA is absolutely working across the US government to collaborate both around science and knowledge. One specific effort that I might point to is an effort that we're co-leading with the Smithsonian Institute to develop the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy. The strategy
Sorry, Janie, you went on mute.
Yes, for some reason it said the host muted me, so apologies for that. So I was talking about the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy, which NOAA is leading with the Smithsonian Institute. It's an interagency effort that's meant to align research and monitoring on life in our ocean, coasts, and Great Lakes for safe and sustainable management, conservation, development, and climate solutions. This ocean biodiversity strategy is focused on a couple of key areas and steps that are really needed to strengthen coordination and delivery of ocean biodiversity and knowledge at the national scale, including ensuring the availability of tools to document and map ocean biodiversity status and trends. We're also working to bolster and establish efforts to conserve, restore, and sustainably use living ocean resources. But I think it's important that we're working through this strategy to establish and incentivize diverse partnerships across scales and sectors, and designing efforts to inspire, educate, and involve the public to discover and value the nation's diverse ocean life. So it really goes beyond interagency collaboration and looks at partnerships across sectors and scales.
Thanks a lot for that. We'll get back to you in a sec. But for now, I will move on to Seema. My next question is for you. Based on your experience in leading a conservation NGO, the Nature Conservancy in India, and working in different philanthropies, what strategies do you believe are most effective in preserving biodiversity while combating climate change?
Thank you, Sumedha, for having me on this panel and also for that question. So science has clearly shown that the most effective strategy amongst the nature-based strategies for climate change is preventing deforestation. We are losing forests at a very rapid pace on this planet. However, and that releases a lot of emissions and carbon into the atmosphere. And preventing deforestation is not only the most inexpensive intervention, it is also the most effective intervention for climate change, as well as for biodiversity conservation. Unfortunately, there is a myth out there or a misunderstanding that we need to prioritize reforestation or revegetation. And often this gets even worse. It gets interpreted as just planting trees. The truth of the matter is that while we do need restoration efforts and revegetation and even planting trees have a role in terms of not preventing climate change as in sequestering carbon, they are not the most effective strategies for either climate action or for biodiversity conservation. And you know that one of the biggest tipping points in climate change for this planet is the Amazon. And since President Lula was elected, he is prioritizing conserving the Amazon. And there is almost 1.5 times the landmass of California in the Amazon that is undesignated. And he has decided to prioritize designating it as public lands. And evidence even from Brazil shows that even mere designation of it as public lands is an effective strategy. We all have heard about paper parks and how they are not effective. But in Brazil, evidence is showing that even just demarcation of those lands as public lands has made a vital difference to maintaining them. So I think that's what we need to focus on. Preserving forests that we have. Doesn't mean we don't take other actions, but I think in terms of priorities, that is the number one priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. I specifically resonate a lot with that, especially with my current work at the Trillion Trees platform. So we always say it's not just about planting trees, but it's about conserving, restoring, and growing trees. So it's not just that you go to a site and just plant a seed or plant a sapling. So I really resonate with that. My next question, just kind of connecting it to this as well, Seema, is for you. What role can financial mechanisms and funding strategies play in supporting climate equity in conservation, restoration, and climate change projects?
I think equity is absolutely fundamental for success, whether you're approaching the problem of climate change or of biodiversity conservation or sheer mere development. Today, all these three things intersect very nicely. But even if we took them apart and thought about success in either of these circles, equity is key. And if you draw up the Venn diagram of all three, equity is where they would intersect. At a global level, India has been in the forefront, and many southern countries are, in terms of asking for equity in action on climate change. When we talk of net zero, for example, countries from the south are demanding that those who caused the problem go first. They need to accelerate action. They need to not be striving for net zero by 2050, but by much earlier, and creating the space for developing countries to go after. So this principle of equity that we are negotiating for in global platforms, I think we need to extend it then nationally as well. Unfortunately, it begins to break down there. We do not prioritize sufficiently the importance of equity in our national policies. And I'm not saying this here just for India, but for many southern countries. Efforts are made in that direction, but oftentimes the poor end up bearing the burden of many of those actions and policies. Take the example of expansion of solar, which is absolutely critical, as part of the transition that this planet needs to witness. But whether it is Brazil or it is India, we are finding that, communities are often getting displaced or not being paid for the land that they have to forego as these projects come up. Solar energy, people tend to forget, is 11 times as land intensive as coal energy is. It's 11 times more intensive, which means that there will be greater conflicts with local communities. And we have to center the principle of equity into all of these initiatives, including in renewable energy, and make sure that we are being mindful of what the people need and prioritizing that. As much as we speak about expansion of renewable energy, we need to be talking about ensuring equity and rights of communities as this expansion takes place. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. I would like to come to Monica now. So Monica, you founded the Humble Bee. So what inspired you to found the Humble Bee firstly, and how does it address the intersection of climate change and biodiversity loss?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Sumita. Hello and namaste, everyone. So Humblebee is my second social enterprise. I studied engineering at IIT Kharagpur. I have my roots in Bihar, Orissa, and Chhattisgarh. And for the last 8 years, I've been working towards unlocking the potential of micro entrepreneurship for social and economic empowerment of the underserved. And I've always wanted to replicate the kind of success Dr. Kurian had with creating Amul by de-risking a dairy farmer. And my driving force in founding Humblebee was to actually ensure sustainable monthly incomes of the indigenous communities. So as we delved deeper into the world of beekeeping, I became very captivated, by the potential of not only it being able to provide economic stability to people, but also to protect our environment, farmers, and affect climate change mitigation and resilience. In fact, 75% of the world's food crops that we consume are pollinated by bees. Their population is declining every day, and there is a catastrophic cascade effect that it might lead to, with respect to global food insecurity. So we stayed with beekeepers over the last 24 months, learned the skill, the science of beekeeping. And incidentally, beekeeping emerged for us as a powerful vehicle for achieving both social and ecological goals simultaneously. And the more layers, I peeled in the process, the more profound, was my awakening, so to say. A beehive is essentially a microcosm that very carefully encapsulates the complexities of nature. And the more you learn about them, the more you get sucked into, this realm of beekeeping. So Humblebee is dedicated to transforming the scientific beekeeping and ecological sustainability in India. We have a comprehensive platform, a tech and touch approach, through which we empower beekeepers and small-scale farmers with scientific knowledge and ethical practices in order to be able to enhance their incomes, ensure quality input supplies, and create fair market opportunities for the indigenous people. Our mission not only addresses the key challenges in India's apiculture landscape, but is also looking to promote gender inclusivity by keeping women at the forefront of this movement that we are creating, and also unlocking, the rural economic growth as you spoke about. So yeah, so that's a quick pointer on why and how we do what we do. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Monica. Just kind of building up on that, bees are essential to even our existence, as we know. But it's not something that is talked about much, like a lot. So how can conservation and restoration efforts be tailored to support bee populations that is declining right now in the face of climate change and habitat loss?
So there are a couple of points that I'd like to state here. So, firstly, it's about habitat restoration and preservation, right? So identification and, actually preservation of bee habitats, which include native vegetation, even wildflowers and, natural floral landscapes, which India is very, bestowed with, so to say. It may also involve reforestation, as Seema was mentioning, and revegetation, as bees continuously need nectar of flowers to to forage. Unless you are a migratory beekeeper, you would need to practice polycropping, which is also good for the soil health. I mean, it's my personal vision to create a bee corridor in India where migratory beekeepers can keep moving their apiaries from place to place, and there can be a series of blooming patterns of flowers. The second thing is about encouraging more agroecological farming methods, polyculture, crop rotation, intercropping, just to be able to ensure continuous supply of floral resources throughout the year. Also, in today's modern day reality of agriculture is that the crops are largely chemical, pesticide ridden, which kills bees in the process. So we are also looking to encourage creation of a positive reinforcement cycle. So, if farmers keep benefiting from bees, they'll be motivated to, follow bee friendly or climate friendly agriculture. It is also about building capacity of farmers. So our farming communities, tribal communities are fragmented. They are situated in deeper pockets. There is scarce support. So providing them with the right attitude, aptitude, and the decision tools, so they are able to practice agriculture and apiculture better. And largely, it's also about raising awareness amongst people on conscious consumption. Making sure that they read the label before they consume, what they find on the shelves. So yeah, so these are a few ways in which we feel that conservation and restoration efforts can be tailored.
Thanks a lot for that, Monica. I would like to move to Radhika now. So Radhika, as Associate Professor and Research Director at Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development, can you share some key findings from your research on integrating climate protection more broadly into development priorities?
Thanks, Sumedha, and thank you to Indiaspora. It's always really wonderful to engage with the work that you all do, and thank you for having me on this panel. So yeah, the sort of integration of climate and development is something that many of us have been working on for a long time. And I think what's interesting in terms of the insights that we get from this is the arc that this sort of theme has taken over time. So initially when we look back, there's always been sort of climate and development being orthogonal to each other. That's the theme that has been prevalent in policy discussions at international fora, at domestic and subnational fora as well. And then, there was this shift where we began to see climate change as becoming one of the different kinds of objectives that countries have. So whether they have that nationally or subnationally, it became clear that climate is one of our many multiple objectives. But often that what we see, particularly in developing country contexts, is that it still was at the bottom of the totem pole, right? There are many more pressing demands, whether that is for jobs, for security, for economics, for poverty reduction, for clean air, for land, housing, all of that. And in some sense, that still remains the umbrella under which a lot of climate change work is pursued. A lot of what we see now is that we're trying, that governments and subnational governments, cities, municipalities are trying to find ways and routes by which they can integrate what, the work that they're already doing and somehow fold climate change into that, right? So if you have a housing development authority, putting in place passive measures, so measures to be able to actually have lower energy demand while also building out that housing, right? So finding those synergies and those pockets where there are overlaps is often the way in which this work has been pursued. But what I find really sort of encouraging of late, and the kind of it's symbolized in some sense in the change in the World Bank's motto that happened at the end of last year, which is to be able to say that actually the goal is no longer just to eradicate poverty, it's actually to eradicate poverty on a livable planet. Right? So it's this sort of central idea of creating livability on this planet and recognizing that actually life on Earth is no longer to be assumed, and it's actually under grave threat in many, for many vulnerable populations and for many scenarios of global warming. And that is actually now fundamentally sort of folded into financial institutions, but also in the ways that government is thinking about this. So I think that this shift over time is encouraging, and it's shown us how climate change has moved from something that's been sort of far away in the corner, considered to be about environment, which is not a priority, and moved much more centrally into what every organization and institution and sector needs to grapple with.
Thanks a lot for that, Radhika. Kind of just again building on this, as we know, policy has a big role to play in moving the needle towards a more sustainable planet, eradicating poverty as well. How can policymakers effectively integrate scientific research on climate change more broadly into decision-making processes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we're talking about climate change, scientific research is really, really important because it's needed to inform policy. Now, the climate climate science is very dynamic. We're learning every day. It has a number of uncertainties and risks, but it's also becoming more and more precise. And it has the ability to be able to guide mitigation, but really importantly, to be able to guide adaptation, to be able to tell us where vulnerabilities lie, who is vulnerable, when will certain climate impacts hit, when will, all forms of extreme weather affect economies, and what is the integration across sectors of these different types of interactions. Now, I think what it requires, though, is the science to be open and clearly communicated, but also for a policy apparatus to be responsive to that science. And I think that's where somehow the bridge isn't so firm in many cases. So what we're looking for is ideally an enterprise where you have the knowledge production of the science that is clearly communicating and working in a way to inform policy. So of course you have to do your academic papers and sort of research outputs, but also to be able to distill that into what is relevant for a policymaker, but to have a policy-making process that is open and responsive to that science, and also deliberative in terms of how it engages with the communities that are going to be affected by the impacts of climate change. Now, this is, of course, an ideal scenario. I think we see pockets of this in different countries, but I think we can do a much better job knowing that, look, we're going to face these risks, and we have the science to help us adapt better and respond better. So it's about bringing these two things together.
Thanks a lot for that. We are kind of short on time, so I will cut it short and move to our final question, which is for all of you. So we all are coming from diverse backgrounds, handling different sectors. So what concrete steps according to you, can individuals, organizations, and governments take to bridge the gap between climate action and biodiversity conservation? So we can start with Janie.
Thank you for the question, Sumedha. I think it is just one of the things that I really love about the America the Beautiful initiative is that it is creating opportunities for more Americans to interact with nature. And I think that is so critical to making these connections, those opportunities to get out there, interact with nature, understand what is at stake in the climate crisis is incredibly important. One of the things that NOAA is doing, and really the main way we're participating in the America the Beautiful initiative, is through the designation of national marine sanctuaries. So these are spaces in the ocean where we can bring the American public to interact with ocean and ocean life in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to do. And so we are in the process of designating 6 national marine sanctuaries right now. They're all at different stages in the process. And this is all towards the goal of conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030. But I hope that this is really just a launching pad, not a finish line, because we really need to continue this work of conservation, both on lands and waters, beyond 30% in the United States. And I hope that one of the things that we can think about is what this is a springboard towards, right? Where do we go after 30 by 30? How do we make the connections between conservation and communities? Maybe the future of conservation is not only these large conservation efforts, large scale conservation efforts that we're pursuing through the national marine sanctuaries, for example, but rather more community focused restoration and conservation priorities, so that we are making those connections to people's daily lives and the places where they live and work and play every day.
Thank you, Janie. Moving to Seema, what would be the concrete steps that you would recommend?
Yeah, I'll try to be very concrete. I think I see a big gap in even tackling climate action between the communities that are worried about energy and what happens there, and the communities that worry about land and how to deal with that. These two communities are more or less operating in their own silos. And I think the best intervention point to bring them together is to improve the modeling exercises. The modeling exercises for net zero, the pathways for achieving climate mitigation, for example, they are also happening in silos. People like in India, for example, most of our emissions come from the energy sector, and that's where the focus and attention is, and it needs to be there. That is the first priority. But eventually, land is also important. And I understand now efforts are underway because NDCs have to be revised, new NDCs, new goals have to be placed by countries at the start of 2025 to the climate convention. The modeling efforts are beginning to come together. They are trying to take a comprehensive look at these things. And I think that's very, very vital. So across the research communities, the modeling communities, the philanthropic communities, to the MDBs, to the governments, I think we need to bring these two communities together to think holistically. And we should be layering on top of that the biodiversity aspect. Otherwise, if we only approach land from the perspective of climate mitigation, we will not get the optimal outcomes we need for biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. Moving on to Monica. What about you? What concrete steps would you recommend?
I think I'd start with saying that, for an individual, rethinking our entire existence as per the rights of nature worldview, where we think that, the nature is alive and humanity is a part of it and not separate or, dominant over it. I think that that could be, the starting point. Needless to say, individuals and organizations can, raise awareness, drive sensitization, engage in local conservation efforts, adopt sustainable, practices in their daily lives. For governments particularly, I think it is very important to create and invest in developing easy and affordable financing instruments for lesser modeled areas like scientific beekeeping. I mean, traditional conventional capital does not understand the mechanics of how some of these models work. It is also important to set ambitious targets with respect to biodiversity and conservation, and invest in R&D, be it with respect to standardization of how biomass is understood and calculated, to actually building a climate stack for agri. So these are a few ways I think actions can be taken.
Thank you, Monica. And finally, Radhika, what concrete steps can different sectors take to bridge this gap?
Yeah, so I like to think about steps in three different categories. So one is sort of personal, right? So what can individuals do in terms of their behaviors, their attitudes, their ability to to inform themselves with knowledge. So there's the sort of personal level of action. Then there's the social level of action, right? And this is where the role of peer influence, of norms, of social movements, all of that is really important. And then there's a third level of action, which is structural, which is the role of governance, of policies, of infrastructure. So I think it's really this combination of the structural, the social, and the personal, and the sort of relationship between the three of these through which concrete action can come about. And we have examples of those actions that our panelists have talked about, but I thought to just give a little bit of a broader view of how it can be organized.
Thanks a lot, Radhika. Thank you so much, dear panelists. I really wish we could sit here for another hour and continue this conversation. But it was an honor to be facilitating this conversation, and thank you so much for joining us. And with this, I will hand it over to Sanjeev.
Thank you so much, Sumedha, and all our panelists. That was really a wonderful panel that we had the pleasure of listening to. Women leaders in the environment space doing diverse and different things, and all working on such important topics. So great to have had all of you as part of the Indiaspora Climate Summit today. We'll move on now to the first in a series of small, short talks on a variety of different subjects by people from different backgrounds. One of the things that MR mentioned when he opened up the event today is that at Indiaspora, we need to be cognizant of not just climate changes. We are cognizant of climate change's impacts, not just on the current generation, but on the generations that follow. And we at Indiaspora take special pride in engaging and interacting with the younger generation. There's a lot that we need to learn from them, a lot of things that we need to engage with them on. And our Diaspora Next initiative aims to engage with younger people of the Indian diaspora from various different parts of the world, including, of course, from India itself. One of the people here today, the person coming up next, who is going to talk about scaling climate solutions, a 16-year-old's perspective, is Varun Sikka. He's a student and climate activist. Varun, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Over to you.
Yeah, no, likewise. Thank you guys for having me. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. All right. Can everyone see the slides all right?
Yep, we can see them.
Cool. All right. Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is, like Sanjeev said, Varun Sikka. I am a 16-year-old high school student from Khan Lab School in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as a climate activist and entrepreneur. Now, being a climate activist and entrepreneur, right, I do a lot of work in, finding solutions for various problems in the fight for climate change. But I especially have an interest in, the problem of how do we remove carbon from the atmosphere, right? Or direct air capture, as it's called. And it kind of started with, a couple of years ago, I was doing this analysis of kind of the magnitude of this problem, right? So, how much carbon dioxide do we really have to remove? And what are our current, what is the current state of the art? What current tools do we have in actually combating this problem as of now? And this kind of led me down, you could say, a rabbit hole of me trying to find or come up with my own, more scalable, more efficient solutions for direct air capture. And those solutions have, led me to where I am today. So in this talk, I'm kind of going to just give you an overview of my journey thus far and just a little discussion at the end of what's next in terms of the climate fight as a whole, summarized in 5 key points. So yeah, without further ado, let's get right into the first point, which is, as I mentioned, we face a massive challenge with regards to carbon removal from the atmosphere. And so far, it's only getting bigger, right? Every year, currently, humanity emits around 37 billion tons per year of carbon dioxide. And I really just want to, emphasize that, right? 37 billion, right? So that's 9 zeros after the 37. That's how many tons of carbon dioxide we are emitting into the atmosphere every single year. And that's only contributing to a total of 1,100 billion, again, billion tons since 1890 that we have added to the atmosphere. And this 1,100 plus excess billion tons of carbon dioxide is contributing to the greater and greater temperature extremes and severe weather extremes that we're seeing every year. Every year is seemingly getting breaking new temperature records that we've never seen before. And if we want to be able to reverse what we're seeing with regards to climate change and global warming, then at least I believe we need to have gigaton scale carbon removal. And that brings us to kind of what the current, state of the art is with regards to carbon removal. So, one of the more kind of thought of as the, I guess, natural method, simpler method that we'd have kind of built into its ecosystems for direct air capture for capturing carbon dioxide is trees, right, and plants. And while I personally believe that trees are unequivocally pretty awesome, I mean, they counter deforestation, they contribute to recreating habitats for animals, and also just contribute to natural beauty. They're not, unfortunately, not that effective at carbon dioxide removal, right? It would take just to go net zero. So that means, absorbing the 37 billion tons we emit every year, just absorbing that much would require 1.6 trillion trees, which is a lot. It's about half of all the trees that currently exist on the planet today. And they take up so much space that if with those 1.6 trillion trees would cover the entirety of North America. So you can imagine, right? Alaska down to Panama, covered head to toe in just trees, no roads, nothing, just trees. That's how much space we would need. And then on top of that, those trees would take years to mature before they get to their full, carbon absorbing capacity. So unfortunately, right, they're not that feasible for direct air capture, which leads us to wonder, okay, are there alternative methods, human-made ones that would work for this, right? That can solve our direct air capture woes. And that brings us to the current state of direct air capture facilities, right? Currently, there are 18 facilities around the world capturing a total of 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And I mean, that's a pretty great start. But if you look at like the largest one of these, which captures around 4,000 tons per year, you would need 10 million of those to go net zero to absorb around 37 billion tons per year. And the other main criticism with current DAC facilities is they take up a lot of energy, right? So if you look at the two main processes involved in a modern DAC facility, there's fanning, which like is basically the process of funneling air, carbon dioxide rich air, into like a system that absorbs the carbon dioxide. You know, you'll have a material called a sorbent that interacts with and binds to your carbon dioxide. And then the second process is desorption, which basically you do some chemical processes to release the trapped carbon dioxide from it and channel it to long-term storage. So when you do that, those between the desorption and the fanning processes, a lot of energy is consumed. So when you're thinking about how to make DAC more efficient, you're thinking not just in terms of increasing absorption capacity, but in terms of reducing energy consumption, right? So this is kind of where my solutions come in. So I've pioneered a solution called AirCat. It's short for air catcher, but I've heard from some friends that it helps to think about a cat flying in midair. But yeah, so the idea simply is wind turbines, right? A form of renewable energy. Plus, as they spin, which is what generates their energy, they leave behind them a massive kind of vortex of air, right? And AirCat leverages that vortex of air as kind of the fanning mechanism. And because this vortex just happens as the wind turbine spins, it doesn't really consume energy or anything. Its net energy impact is none, right? In fact, in a sense, because that spinning action is what allows the wind turbine to generate energy, it, in a sense, produces energy, the fanning process. So then after that, you'll kind of have carbon dioxide go into a sorbent layer, same deal as a typical DAC facility, ambient non-carbon dioxide air goes out the other end. And then comes the desorption. So the trick with the desorption in the AirCat is that wind turbines are so powerful that more than half of the energy they actually could produce gets wasted because the electrical grid is not powerful enough to take all of the energy that it produces. So over half of it doesn't go anywhere. It just gets wasted. And we leverage this wasted energy for the desorption process. And since that wasted energy doesn't go into the grid anyway, the net energy impact on the grid of the AirCat is zero. So the AirCat has zero net power use. So on top of that, AirCat is also compatible with all kinds of state-of-the-art sorbents, and it would also rely on, turbine production and maintenance cycles so that it hinders as little as possible the efficiency of the turbine itself. At the same time, it's also a more efficient design in terms of absorption capacity. According to our calculations, one AirCat the size roughly of a wind turbine that would be placed behind one wind turbine can do around 1,000 tons per day of carbon dioxide. Multiply that by 365, that's, 365,000 tons per year of carbon dioxide. So we've also got several kind of variants of the AirCat, based on size. Like I mentioned, it's compatible with all kinds of sorbents too. Location too, so it's actually possible to have residential scale wind turbines, the kind that you can have in your backyard, little ones that will power kind of your home. We've designed a prototype that you can actually place behind a residential scale wind turbine, and it actually works. And now we're currently partnering with industry to make and deploy a demo version of an industrial scale prototype. So yeah, looking forward to that. Now beyond just AirCat and beyond DAC in general, well, first off, there are two other designs that I'm working on in DAC related. But you'll have to stay tuned for those. Hopefully, though, they'll be more scalable, more sustainable than what we've currently got with regards to AirCat. Aside from that, there are many other promising efforts aside from, from other startups, what people are doing that intend to make DAC facilities more energy efficient and more efficient in terms of absorption capacity, like what I'm doing with AirCat, right? But the climate fight extends way beyond just removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from just, cleaning up that kind of mess we've made in the atmosphere, right? For example, there's also a I guess, more physical, tangible mess that we've made in the oceans, right? That we really have to clean up. Otherwise, it's going to cause severe damage to, marine ecosystems and all that. There's also many severe impacts that climate change is having on water access, or access to clean water, because global warming is causing droughts across the world. For example, where I live in California, California has been in a drought for many, many years, and that's really hindering water access for a lot of people in the state. Similarly, it's also hindering food access as natural disasters get worse and destroy farmland and things like that. It's also destroying homes, so that's causing a lot of displacement and migration and lack of, safe shelter for people. And if we want to furthermore prevent these things from happening, then we need a way to kind of prevent this. And that comes from things like creating better, more cleaner, more efficient forms of renewable energy, for example, to give ourselves a power source that is clean and will sustain us for generations to come, right? We also need more eco-friendly industries, the industries that produce for us things like materials critical in building, like cement and steel, or construction industries or transportation industries. These industries need to become more eco-friendly if we want to make a dent in the climate fight. And that starts with all of us, right? So if we want to, there's this saying, right? It takes a village, right? And for a fight the size of, the entirety of humanity, then that village that it takes is also the size of the entirety of humanity. And there are many, many opportunities out there, conferences, contests, for people to come up with ideas and contribute in whatever way they want, big or small, to the climate fight. And if we want to be able to make a dent, everyone needs to be contributing, even if it's a small way. So, yeah. Once again, thank you guys so much for having me and for listening. And yeah, thank you so much.
Varin, that was just incredible. I mean, it is so inspiring to hear someone like yourself. It's so inspiring to hear someone like yourself, someone so young who is opening our eyes and making us think so seriously about innovative ways in which we can move towards solutions for the climate problem. And you laid out your presentation so clearly and so lucidly. It was just great having you and great listening to you. Looking forward to further engagement with you at Indiaspora over the years. And we'll be in touch, I'm sure, after this event as well. But thank you for speaking with us today. Thanks. Thanks, Varin. We'll now move on to our next short talk. And this is by Mishal Thadani, who is the founder of Rhizome. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I believe Mishal is joining us from my neck of the woods, the Washington area. And he's going to talk about AI for a climate resilient future. So Mishal, if you're on, please join us. Yeah, thank you. I see you there. Thanks, Mishal.
You're muted, Mishal.
You're muted. Sorry, we can't hear you. You're muted. We can see you, but we can't.
Sorry about that. It's as if this is the first time that I've come off mute. So thank you so much for the opportunity, first of all. And I just got to say that the last presentation was extremely inspirational. I was playing my Game Boy at 16 years old while he's designing DAC systems that are net zero. So very cool to see. So for my presentation here, I wanted to focus on my story in energy and climate. I've been in this space for about 15 years, doing a variety of things. And I would like to, sort of walk through the journey to get to where I am today, which is effectively a co-founder and CEO of Rhizome, where we build climate resilience application and tools for enterprises to help them identify climate-related risks and then mitigate those risks for themselves and communities. So what I'd like to start with is I've been interested in energy and climate since I was in high school, and then coming out of college, just as in Houston, Texas at Rice University, in the middle of oil and gas capital of the world, I was really excited to get my first job in clean energy at a utility scale wind energy developer. And this was an amazing experience, climbing wind turbines, siting them, permitting them, and then ultimately seeing them through to construction. Interestingly enough, I was doing it for none other than BP. So while it was interesting to say that I worked for BP, when at the end of the day, we're trying to represent an energy shift. At the end of the day, it really represented the ability to work on very high technology energy transformation projects that were starting to get deployed across the United States. Wind was a little bit slow for me. It takes normally 3 to 5 years to develop those utility scale projects. And I wanted something a little bit faster paced. I like moving relatively quickly. So I jumped into the residential, commercial, and community solar space. I joined a really fast growing startup that was scaling across the country, working with local communities, with customers on developing residential, commercial, and then eventually community solar projects. The local aspect of it really appealed to me, working with everyday individuals on identifying what their home electrification and home net zero goals are, and working with businesses to identify, based on their energy load, how can you both reduce their energy burden as well as increase their or lower their carbon footprint. And while that was happening, I moved to Washington, D.C., where, as one might imagine, I got very active politically in the local community. I started testifying at the local DC council related to energy and environmental bills. I helped work with DC council members on passing legislation related to community solar, giving renters the ability to participate in the solar economy. I worked on a bill related to the deployment of distributed energy resources, and then worked with the regulator on grid modernization proceedings as well. And this was all in my spare time. When we ended up getting rules passed related to community solar, I knew that I could do something a little bit extra to help that market grow. So I launched my first company, which was a community solar company called District Solar, to help grow and develop and deploy community solar projects in DC and Maryland. And ultimately, it was exciting. We got some projects built. It was very much a learning experience, but we didn't really have many resources. We didn't see scale in the market because the market was growing too slowly. These are infrastructure projects. At the end of the day, you have to interconnect with the local utility, which is a slow process. And ultimately, we ended up winding down that business. What I ended up finding and ended up resonating with me the most in my journey in doing that for several years was that I recognized I had one particular skill set that was pretty effective. And that was bringing concepts of new technologies and business models to policymakers and regulators to help transform an industry that's heavily regulated, the electric utility industry, into one that it can actually be a tool for enabling decarbonization and increasing the reliability and resilience of everyone that's connected to the system. And that's where I started getting very interested in the AI space. I was leading the team at Urbint, an AI technology company. There are massive amounts of use cases for AI to be able to automate the deployment of distributed energy resources, to really optimize power grid flow, to make sure that the peaks when emissions are the highest are the less times that we're actually using that energy, and really help scale those efficiencies and those resources at the same time. So I was really excited about AI and Urbint's capability to work with utilities to deploy those tools. And just to give you a sense of what we were working on as one of our use cases, this is a gas pipeline that was decommissioned in the city of Chicago 5 years ago in 2019. And this pipe was installed when Abraham Lincoln was president, or almost 200 years ago. So this pipe was just decommissioned after 200 years, and you can see the degradation on it. Now, there are many pipelines across the country that develop this type of decay over time. And we were training artificial intelligence models to really identify which pipelines those must be, and then proactively go and replace those pipelines, of course, for environmental and safety concerns, methane mitigation, as well as preventing injuries and deaths from potential explosions. And the more that we were working on these types of use cases, the more I got interested in how AI could actually be used to mitigate the impacts on the electric system from extreme weather events. And so this kind of harkened back to 2021 in Winter Storm Uri. When that hit in Texas, the entire power grid went down for more than 3 days. Many people died, almost 200 people died. And of course, there were many disruptions in supply chains, businesses, major economic losses. I'm from Texas. I was born and raised there. As I mentioned, I went to Rice and I spent some time in Houston. And so this one hit pretty close to home. I wanted to explore exactly how these same types of AI modeling approaches could be used to really help enhance how we operate and plan the system of the future to be more resilient to extreme weather. And in reflection, there are lots of different extreme weather events that are having an impact with electric utilities today. If you look at this component right here, it's called the C-hook. Now, this C-hook, as you can tell, is extremely rusted and snapped in 2020 and owned and operated by Pacific Gas and Electric out in the Bay Area. And it caused one of the most devastating wildfires in California, killing over 80 people in California. And I believe the cost of the wildfire was about 500 billion, around 464 billion, all because this C-hook snapped. It was holding a cable to a transmission tower. That cable was then went haywire, made contact with some vegetation, and then sparked a wildfire. And when you zoom out and you think about all of the risks and hazards that electric utilities might be facing, what we end up coming down to is that this is a $500 billion problem. And that is the gap in terms of the amount that needs to be invested in the electric utility sector to mitigate the increasing risks from increasing frequency and severity of all types of climate hazards that are causing more and more disruptions, outages, loss of life, so on and so forth. So we need to invest $500 billion into the system to only mitigate the increases at its current levels. Obviously, this gap is growing quite widely. And I took this thesis and I started writing about it. I was talking to utilities, regulators on what exactly is required in the electric utility industry to enable the planning of a more resilient system. And I ended up leaving my former company and doing a lot of investigation on my own. And you can see the early stages of a startup here where, again, very little money, just showing up at meetings, trying to gather as much information as we could from utilities, their practices, the data that they have, their technology systems, so on and so forth, doing the product discovery and customer discovery work in order to get to what we have developed today. And that's what we refer to as Rhizome's platform. We've designed a petabyte scale system to ingest utility system data from our customers. And we've already architected weather and climate information. So that's where a lot of the cloud scale resources come into play. We layer on vegetation, and then we layer on information related to socioeconomic losses from those power outages. And when we layer on these pieces of information, we end up creating models that are able to learn from historic extreme weather events. Where are the vulnerabilities on the grid given certain grid asset characteristics, like a rusted C-hook, for instance? Train models to understand the probability of failure given the presence of different extreme weather circumstances, and then using climate data, forecast those risks into the future. We've developed a full application to support the asset planners and engineers at utilities to assess vulnerabilities on the grid quickly through that geospatial format, optimize different investments, and then ultimately justify those investments to their regulators so that it can actually close that resilience investment gap. Where we are today is, or rather where we were as of October, we raised $2.5 million in our first venture round in order to scale this technology across the electric utility sector in the US and Canada. And it's a really exciting time for us. We're continuing to work with more and more utilities. But what I'd like to leave everyone with is kind of an offer here on ways to get involved in climate if you'd like to become more involved, either professionally or not. And here are my recommendations in subsequent order. This is number one, when you're exploring working in this space or just trying to get better about the issues, make sure to do your own research and analysis, just like that previous presentation, which was excellent. Number two is get involved locally. You won't learn as much as when you actually go and advocate for something, and then meet the people that are doing that similar types of advocacy. And that leads to number three, is to meet kindred spirits who are, generally speaking, aligned with your worldview, or even have some differences, but generally speaking, just want to see a better place in the issue set that you've identified. If you do those three things, then I think we'll get a lot of people that are making a huge effort in climate, and we'd be really excited to see that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michal. This was really, really excellent. So nice to know that there's someone as passionate as you working in my neighborhood, especially. This is a very narrow, selfish perspective, I guess, but it resonates because you touched upon two themes that are so important to Indiaspora: AI and climate. And there are two things that we are holding events on. In fact, we have an AI for Social Good Summit coming up in the Bay Area in California on the 26th of April. And, it's great to know that you've kind of married those two issues in what you've just spoken about here with us today. So thank you. We'll now move on to a speaker from Ottawa, Ontario in Canada. Megan Leslie is the president and CEO at the World Wildlife Fund, WWF in Canada. And she's going to talk about the role of nature in fighting climate change. Megan, Canada is a country that Indiaspora pays a lot of attention to. We have been there on numerous occasions. We've interacted with a lot of top folks in government and philanthropy and academia and business and the arts and so on and so forth. And Canada holds a soft spot in my heart as well, being a University of Toronto alum. So delighted to have you on, and the floor is yours.
Excellent, thanks. And I'm glad that Canada holds a special place in your heart. Me too. Also, Michelle, the idea of like finding kindred spirits, you stole my my conclusion. Yes, and I think that's why we're all here, because we are kindred spirits. That's what, and we care about these issues. So as you heard, my name is Megan Leslie, President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada. I'm coming to you from Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. And I just want to take a moment to point out that the waters and the lands that I'll be talking about continue to be, and always will be Native land. I really want to thank Indiaspora for hosting an event called Urgent Climate Conversations, because we're in a climate crisis and it's urgent and we should be talking about it. Now, we have been talking about climate change for a long time. But I really think that the tone of things, I mean, it's a little bit different now, isn't it? I'm certainly finding these conversations different. I mean, we used to think about UN scientists and what they talked about. They talked about the impending climate crisis, like it was something happening in the future. But now they're telling us it's here. And we're all seeing the impacts. I mean, we know about landslides and fires and floods. We hear about how it impacts things like food security, increased damage to our homes and community. We read about the fact that the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. And to be honest, I'm pretty tired of talking about it. But the thing is, what I'm tired of is I don't want to talk about climate impacts anymore. I want us to start talking about the solutions to climate change, like a number of the speakers that have presented today, because the solutions are there, they exist, they're happening now, and it's not too late to reverse the course we're on. Listening to the other speakers, one of my takeaways is that we need all those solutions, everything, everywhere, all at once. So I really want to talk about how nature is one of those solutions, and it's actually a solution to more than one problem. And I think my presentation will be a good dovetail to that earlier conversation on conservation and climate change. So we all know if we're going to fight climate change, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I just want to check, because I think we were going to have a poll and I didn't double check that the poll. Oh, look at that. Okay. So before you answer, okay, think about these are a list of global sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So in front of you, you've got transportation, nature, industry, electricity and heat, livestock and buildings. If we're going to fight climate change, we've got to reduce these greenhouse gases. So think about what the biggest sources of emissions are. And if you had to choose the top 3 sources of greenhouse gases, what would they be? So go in there, choose your top 3 and click submit. It says host and panelists can't vote, so my vote's not going to count, but yours will. So do you think it's transportation, nature, industry, electricity and heat, livestock, buildings? Don't worry, this is all anonymous, so vote with gusto. And maybe I'll give you 1 sec and then we can close the poll and see what our answers are. Top 3 sources of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And whoever's running this magical poll, thank you for making it happen. And can you close it and share the answers with us? So, this is working out beautifully. Thank you. So let's have a look at these answers here. So you were right if you chose electricity and industry. So electricity and heat, oh wow, that wasn't that popular. People were really into buildings and livestock. Industry got a good response, electricity and heat. So those were the 2, electricity and heat and industry are top 2. So congratulations if you got it right. The third one, also not very many people voted for this, was nature. So feel free to close the poll. If you're sitting there thinking, is the head of the World Wildlife Fund saying that nature is bad? How could nature possibly be bad? Well, don't worry, nature isn't bad, but let's think about how we're using nature, okay? What we're doing with nature on our planet, how we use our landscapes and seascapes. So we heard from other presenters, nature stores carbon, and a lot of us learned that in elementary school, okay? This image has got the 2 oxygens and the carbon, that's CO2, so trees are absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They keep the carbon, they release the oxygen. Well, like a lot of the other presenters have been talking about, trees aren't that effective at this. Well, the thing is, it's not just trees. It's everything. It's grasses and shrubs, it's trilliums and bulrushes, and they store carbon in their leaves and roots. And when those plants die, they actually integrate that carbon into the soil. The soil, I mean, healthy soil is so rich in carbon. So I'm talking about wetlands and peatlands and grasslands. The soil stores carbon too. And when we destroy nature, we disrupt those soils, we're releasing that carbon back up into the atmosphere. So when we cut down our forests, yes, trees, we drain our wetlands, we dig up our peatlands, we're taking carbon that's locked in those soils and plants, we're turning it into carbon that's released into our atmosphere. So an unbelievable 30% of global greenhouse gases comes from the destruction of nature. Because we build our roads, we have our farms, we're draining our wetlands to build new shopping malls. So we need to stop that release of carbon by looking at where is the carbon in the landscape and protecting those rich stores of carbon. Like Seema Paul said about the Amazon, protection of that carbon in the ecosystems. That is the best thing that we can do and prevent that conversion of carbon. And where ecosystems are degraded, like here on the left side of your screen, we actually do need to plant new plants and restore those ecosystems in a way that will also restore that carbon. Yes, it will take time, but it is worth it. I'll talk a little bit about that. So we can actually tackle climate change by protecting ecosystem carbon and restoring ecosystem carbon. So amazing. Nature can help us. It's not the only solution. We need all the solutions, but it is a solution. Nature can help us fight climate change. But the amazing thing is there's more. So in addition to nature being a tool to combat climate change, nature is a building block for biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is just a fancy word for the diversity of life on our planet. Here in Canada, where I am, and actually around the world, biodiversity is on a steep decline. And it's in part because we keep eating up that nature, cutting down the forest, draining the wetlands, releasing the carbon. Well, those forests and wetlands are also habitat for wildlife. Habitat is where wildlife forages, they find their food, they rest, they raise their young. And biodiversity needs nature, which means that we can now use nature to fight climate change, but we can also use it to fight biodiversity loss. Another thing that nature can do is it fuels our economy. So I want you to imagine a little bird. And a little bird, they scatter a seed that produces a Douglas fir that is then sustainably harvested, processed into timber. That timber is built into a home. It's then marketed and sold. It's heated and serviced. It's furnished, insured. I just named a whole lot of industries. That little bird sustains an entire value chain. And we need to make sure that she has a home. That home is in nature. So we are racking up a great list. Nature can help us fight climate change. It's good for biodiversity. It supports the economy. Anything else? Well, here in Canada, we are on a journey of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And here in Canada, that means First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And we have an opportunity in front of us right now to do conservation in a just and ethical way. Some of the other speakers talked about equity in this work. Well, if we work to support the conservation priorities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, that's exactly what we're getting at. And I want to share an example of this work through something, one of our partners, the Secwepemcúlecw Restoration and Stewardship Society, and their efforts to reforest Elephant Hill. Now, this is a nearly 200,000 hectare area of territory of their nations near Kamloops, British Columbia. And this area burned in a fire for 3 months during 2017. And the aftermath of the fire left community members reeling. A lot of them lost their homes, and the surrounding landscapes were changed forever. It even led to post-fire erosion and landslides that further damaged habitat, including even river habitat like salmon habitat. Often, when we reforest these areas, we're prioritizing planting fast-growing coniferous trees that have a higher economic value for logging. But instead, the community wanted to set their own approach, an approach that was grounded in their own values and their Indigenous knowledge that prioritized resiliency and biodiversity, that didn't prioritize wood products for sale and prioritized the ecosystem. So they prioritized planting an understory below that canopy, so not just trees, but with trees, also deciduous trees, which happen to be more fire resistant. It also meant measuring and monitoring the carbon left in their landscapes and how it's changing over time so that they could validate their approach and attract new investors to support their restoration efforts. This is where technology comes in. So historically, it's been extremely costly and time-consuming to measure and monitor carbon in nature. It's difficult to do a before and after assessment, almost impossible to show how carbon levels change in reaction to conservation efforts. So we really needed an inexpensive and efficient approach to measuring carbon in nature that was also user-friendly. We started this Carbon Tech Challenge, and now one of the final award recipients is working with the Secwepemcúlecw Restoration Society to help validate their efforts. And one of the finalists developed this software using LiDAR data and machine learning to calculate carbon found in forest biomass. And they can tell us if these trees are surviving following restoration. So we're restoring the landscape, bringing back the habitat for wildlife, bringing back carbon in that rich, messy forest, and using traditional Indigenous knowledge about this forest that will ensure it's more resilient against fires in the future. So I'll wrap by saying, I'm at World Wildlife Fund Canada. We've always seen conservation as an important part of the fight against biodiversity loss, but it's also a solution to climate change. It's also about our economy. It's also about reconciliation. And so we're trying to do our part as one organization. Our commitment is to restore 1 million hectares of habitat, to protect and steward 100 million hectares of habitat, to sequester 30 megatons of carbon, but we're just one organization, right? And it's a big continent or hemisphere. We're in the Western Hemisphere. So I'm going to ask you to think about the company you work for, or your town council, or a community or faith group you're involved in. And can this organization make some commitments like this that contribute to habitat and carbon? Maybe it's planting a pollinator garden at your kid's school, or taking that area in the parking lot at work and saying, hey, it floods every year. Maybe it's because it used to be a wetland. Can we restore that area and start to bring back wildlife? So think about how you're engaged in your community, and can you make these kinds of efforts towards biodiversity and carbon restoration? And then also think about what organizations are out there already doing the work. They need you. They need you as a volunteer. They need you to sign up as a member, because membership makes them stronger. They need your charitable donations. So when you're thinking about where to put your money, put that lens on. And so finding kindred spirits and figuring out ways that you can support them to support the community in these kinds of biodiversity and climate change efforts can bring us a long way. Thanks. That's all I have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Megan. You brought so many important angles, so many diverse angles, and really shone a lens onto the problem with various different types of solutions that impact different important aspects of life. So really enjoyed your presentation and loved having you. Hopefully we'll meet up in, when we're up in Canada next time.
Perfect. And thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciated it.
Not at all. Great. Thanks for speaking. And now we'll move on to our last talk for the day. It's going to be a presentation of pre-recorded video, and the topic is beyond just carbon removal, enhanced rock weathering as a CDR rock star, and that's carbon dioxide removal, of course. And it's by Sasank Munukutla, who is the co-founder of Pterodot. So if we can queue up Sasank's video, I think we already have it up. We can play it now.
Sarah, I can't hear it.
Yeah, I think the sound is a problem. If you'll give us just a couple of seconds, we'll be back.
I'm Sasank, co-founder of Pterodot, a climate tech startup with the mission to accelerate highly impactful gigaton-scale carbon dioxide removal while regenerating Earth. I apologize for not being able to be here live today, as I'm in Brazil on the field, as we're currently having a live deployment of our carbon dioxide removal project. I'm really excited to share more today about the literal and figurative rock star of carbon dioxide removal, enhanced rock weathering. For some context, as many of us know today, as a result of increased greenhouse gas emissions, our planet is set to reach over 3 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. Life at 3 degrees Celsius of warming is really scary. This will lead to multiple global catastrophes, be it severe droughts, flooding, heat waves, impacts on our food system that will impacts on biodiversity as well, that will impact all 10 billion people on their planet and will not enable us to thrive as a population. We have 2 key levers to address this to get to net zero. One is to reduce our existing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, by electrifying a lot of transport and other key industrial processes. And the second lever we have is removing carbon for those emissions that we can't remove or are hard to abate. Today's talk, I'll focus on carbon removal. Per the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we need to scale up to 10 billion tons of carbon removal per year by 2050 to achieve net zero and to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid climate tipping points and all those negative consequences I talked about earlier. So even with a lot of efforts first to reduce our existing emissions, we really need to scale up carbon removal. On a positive note, there are multiple negative emissions technologies, NETs, that can help us achieve net zero by 2050. The IPCC does a comparison of some of the major NETs over here, looking at both their cost as well as their potentials. You'll know enhanced rock weathering is right in the center with a pretty decent cost, but also large potential as well. What's not pictured here is, of course, the tens and hundreds of other solutions that are being tested and engineered right now in labs and research centers around the world. And the important thing I want to emphasize is, while focusing on enhanced rock weathering, we do need a portfolio of climate solutions ultimately to have our best chance of reaching net zero. And it's important that all these solutions are worked on and scaled up in parallel to give us the best opportunity as a planet. With that, I'll shift focus to the CDR rockstar enhanced rock weathering. What is enhanced rock weathering? Well, first of all, Earth has a natural carbon cycle already that removes more than 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually. This is the silicate weathering cycle. So we have silicate rocks massively present around our planet. When it rains on these rocks, they weather, releasing cations, so think calcium and magnesium. These cations bind with atmospheric CO2 in the water to form bicarbonate, which is a stable form. And this bicarbonate then flows through the groundwater, streams and reverts to the ocean, where it remains stable for hundreds of thousands of years. So it's awesome that this already happens, but the timescale and when this happens is thousands, if not millennia of years. So really geological timescales. What enhanced rock weathering aims to do is simply takes this process and speeds it up. So firstly, you crush this rock into finely ground particles, and thus you increase the surface area by thousands, if not millions of times. And at the same time, you spread this into tropical soil that is warm and wet, and that further accelerates the reaction rate, which effectively allows you to remove carbon in years and not centuries, if not thousands of years, unlike with the natural silicate weathering cycle. And what really is exciting to me about enhanced rock weathering is a path to a gigaton scale of carbon removal by 2030, specifically in tropical ecosystems. So 75% of ERW potential is actually in the tropics. And what's even more exciting is not only do you have this massive potential, but ERW is actually even faster in the tropics, 3 times faster due to the warm and wet climate. So the combination of a lot of potential as well as fast weathering. And much of the global south actually coincides with tropical ecosystems. And as many of us know here, the global south will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. So there's this real opportunity to take the global south and have them basically scale up this very important climate and be a driver of this very important climate solution, which personally to me is really, really exciting. And when we look at tropical ecosystems, just what's worth mentioning, where areas where there's a lot of impact is Brazil, India, Southeast Asia, also parts of East and Sub-Saharan Africa. So beyond just, of course, carbon removal, and the idea behind this talk is beyond just carbon, enhanced rock weathering has quite a few co-benefits. And to just name a few, you can regenerate degraded land, so you can take land that is no longer productive and remineralize it in the sense and now make it productive. You can reduce the need for synthetic fertilizer and liming, which can often contribute greenhouse gas emissions, but also reduce input costs for farmers as a result. You can make land more productive, improve yield. You can rebuild soil biodiversity. You can alleviate deforestation pressure. 90% of actual deforestation is driven by agricultural expansion. So both by making existing land more productive and also taking degraded land and making that more productive, you kind of eliminate and reduce this need for deforestation. You can improve the retention of water in soil, which makes basic crops more resilient to both droughts and floods. And ultimately, you can foster economic development through scaling up enhanced rock weathering. And what's really particularly exciting to me with enhanced rock weathering is when we look at a lot of the other climate solutions, and again, I want to emphasize it's important that all of these solutions do need to scale. You typically kind of get these trade-offs. So if you either get, permanent removal that's immediately scalable, or you get these important co-benefits, and it's kind of like you have to pick one of these two things. And a quick comparison here, and what excites me about enhanced rock weathering is you kind of don't really have this trade-off with enhanced rock weathering. You get the permanent removal, you get the immediate scalability, but you also get the co-benefits. So it's really kind of cool that you can get the best of both worlds here. And what's also worth noting with enhanced rock weathering is you can actually utilize existing rocks from waste streams, for example, mining waste. So you actually don't have to, mine for new rocks. You can take existing waste streams and kind of make them productive, especially from mines, but also from construction. So that's another piece that makes enhanced rock weathering in my head a true rock star. So on the whole, in summary, enhanced rock weathering is an incredibly impactful global climate solution that we can scale today. We can mitigate climate change, we can make our food system more resilient, and ultimately lead to economic development and prosperity. And it has impact across multiple UN Sustainable Development Goals, which really shows how impactful it can be in thinking about sustainability holistically beyond just carbon removal. With that, I'll shift a bit more to a bit about Teradot. So we're on a mission, as I said, to enable gigaton scale CDR that can regenerate Earth. The status quo is if we continue with business as usual, 90% of the world's soil will be severely degraded by 2050. This will cost the world's economy $23 billion per year, drive global emissions, deforestation, biodiversity loss, and widespread famine. So a lot of multiple global catastrophes. On the other hand, if we deploy durable carbon removal solutions that can regenerate degraded land, we can remove billions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere, prevent deforestation, improve farmer livelihoods, and strengthen global food security. And really, which future we will live in is up to us. Our approach to Teradot is to build a team, science, and technology to unlock the global potential of enhanced rock weathering. So everything starts with their team. We've built out a world-class science team advised by several climate experts from Stanford, where I studied and my co-founder both studied. And we, of course, have also built out a world-class business and technology team drawing from expertise in both academia and industry as well. Everything we do is open science. Our MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification approach is fully open and transparent, so we can learn and build, trust at the speed and scale that climate demands. We're actively participating in several industry groups and sharing our learnings and pushing the industry forward as well. And on the technology piece, we're actually building out a digital platform to enable us to build and coordinate an ecosystem of partners to credibly deploy ERW at gigaton scale beyond 2030. So the important thing with that is that we know that just us as one startup is not going to get to that scale. And what's more important is we activate a whole ecosystem. And we're doing all of this specifically for the tropics, starting in Brazil, where I'm currently at for our deployments. And again, I apologize for not being able to join live. So with our ecosystem, we're continuing to rapidly scale up removal. We've been doing research and develop since January 2022. And each of our deployments, basically, were very intentional to de-risk key signs, tech, and operational challenges. So we had our first deployment where we aimed to remove about 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in October 2023. We're currently doing a 10,000 ton carbon dioxide removal, where I'm calling in live from. And we're de-risking some of our larger scale MRV approaches over here. And all this is, of course, building up to a gigaton of removal per year by 2030, and ultimately de-risking the idea of bringing this whole ecosystem together and also optimizing deployments as well. So with that, I know I went very deep into one climate solutions, but I also like to kind of zoom out, see the forest for the trees, if you will, and remember the importance of what drives us and drives all of our work. So over here, what you see is an image of planet Earth. It's called Pale Blue Dot by NASA's Voyager that was taken in 1990. And Carl Sagan wrote a whole book about this picture and has a lot of famous quotes and speeches on this. But the idea of this pale blue dot and Carl Sagan's many quotes on this ultimately inspired actually the name Teradot. So I wanted to end with this as a source of motivation and a reminder of why our work is so important. The name Teradot is Terra for Earth, but also pale blue dot. So we kind of combine those two ideas together. So I'll end on this quote, which hopefully helps us remind us why this work is so important and what drives me personally and all of us, I'm sure, over here today. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of. Every human being who ever was lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forger, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Carl Sagan. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to connect after this talk asynchronously, hop on any calls to answer any other questions, or just also learn about all the amazing work that I'm sure everyone here is doing. Thank you very much, and apologies again for not being here live, calling in live from Brazil on the field. Thank you.
What a powerful way to end. And Sasank obviously is not with us here today, but I hope that he's having a great time in Brazil, doing all of the hard work that he's doing that gives us hope for the future. And really appreciate him sending along this presentation. We're going to end today's event with a performance, but to introduce the performer, I would like to call upon my colleague, Neha Dewan. Neha is the Vice President of Operations and General Counsel at Indiaspora and lives just outside of New York City. So Neha, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. So I've had the pleasure of knowing Jay Maya for several years now. She's a delightful young lady who is an absolute rock star. She makes an impression on anybody that crosses path with her and is a rising star on the global musical stage with tens of thousands of followers. And here's a little snippet of why that's the case. So turning it over to you, Jay Maya. Thank you.
Hi, oh my goodness, thank you all so much for having me. I am such a fan of Indiaspora and the work that is being done. And I just thought that that last quote from the last speech was so poignant. It really makes me think about the work that is so important to be done here and in other organizations. So thank you all for everything you do. I'm Jay Maya. I am a singer-songwriter, and I thought I would share a couple of songs with you today as I have the honor to close out today's session. This first song I actually feel like is a perfect segue from the previous quote. It's a song I wrote called Rome from my first album, Poetic License. And I wrote it after sitting one night and thinking about how much work needed to be done to create the world that I think we all want to see, a world that is fair and equal for all. And I think it's easy to get down on yourself or to feel discouraged about that world existing. But I wrote this song as a reminder that that world exists in the future, and it might take a little bit of time to get there, but it's worth the wait. So this is called Rome. I can see it now, a shining horizon beyond the bow. I can feel it high
wash away the sins of the past to build what can last. Oh, I know you are afraid. Close your eyes, say a prayer, and all the roads will take you there. All the roads lead back to Rome, to the place inside that you call home. A hero's journey comes alone. All the roads, yeah, all the roads.
Thank you so much. That's a song called Rome. And to continue us in the tradition of having a song that is about a metaphorical city on a hill, I'm closing out with a song that many of you all might know called Vienna by Billy Joel. This song is personally one I love a lot. And again, to the message that I shared previously, it is a reminder that good things often take time. Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. What an honor to play for you all today. And thank you so much for Indiaspora again for the work you do. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Amaya. That was really, really powerful. And I was just checking my messages and everybody was agreeing that you have a beautiful voice. So you do you. And, you'll certainly make us proud, but grateful that you were able to share some songs with us. So thanks so much. Take care. And I'll turn it over to you, Sanjeev.
It's beautiful. Thanks, Neha. It's beautiful to have had Jay Maya with us on 2 or 3 different occasions now for our events. Always love having you, Jay Maya, if you're still on. Just love your music, your songs, and enjoy interacting with you. So thanks for being with us here again. So we are at the close of our Western Hemisphere Climate Summit for 2024. There is an Eastern Hemisphere segment that will be coming up in approximately 9 hours, a little under 9 hours, at 12 midnight US Eastern time. It's 3 p.m. right now on the East Coast in the US, a little past 3 p.m. So a little under 9 hours, that's 9:30 a.m. India time on Friday is when we will have the Eastern Hemisphere Climate Summit that Indiaspora will bring to you. But the Western Hemisphere session was excellent. We had so many different speakers from a variety of different disciplines and realms talking to us from their perspective about why the climate problem is so urgent and what we can do to resolve it, or at least help take steps towards resolution. This is a subject that Indiaspora cares deeply about, as I think MR mentioned at the very outset in his remarks. You will see Indiaspora do some more work on this. We plan to do some more work around UN Climate Week as well in September in New York. And there's more to come from Indiaspora in this regard. Thank you all for those of you that attended and participated. Really appreciate you being part of this network at Indiaspora. We have the skills, the capability, and the passion to be able to make a difference on this topic du jour of the day. So let's come together and do that. But for now, it's goodbye from here in Washington, D.C.